Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight, we open the doors on the story of Alice Perez, born into obscurity in the plague years of the middle 14th hundred, and grown by patience and by nerve into the closest companion of an aging Edward III. Her tale runs from a nameless village to the private chambers of a widower king, from wardrobe rolls and manor deeds to the benches of Westminster, and it will keep us in the medieval English shires for some hours yet. Settle in and let the night take its unhurried shape around you. If you enjoy these long-considered walks through the medieval English past, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to tap the little bell beside it. That small tap tells the sleep algorithms to send another quiet listener this way when the evening turns dim. And it is the kindest thing you can do to keep these long tellings going. Alice's story is a slow one, patient and unfolded. And the sort of listener who has found their way here is exactly the sort of listener she rewards. Picture this. It is the summer of 1348, and a sickness has arrived from the sea. Ships from Gascony put in at the Dorset coast, and within weeks the affliction that had already emptied the towns of Italy and the villages of Provence was moving inland along the trackways and river routes of Wessex. By the end of that season, it had reached London. By the close of the following one, it had reached the far north. When it had finished its work, some students of the calamity estimate that a third of the population of the island was gone. Others say closer to half. The exact number is unrecoverable, because there was no one left to count, and no one still counting had the leisure to write it down. It is difficult to describe the effect of such a mortality on a society without lapsing into abstractions, and abstractions do not sleep well in the mind. So let us try instead to consider what it meant in ordinary places. In a village of 40 households, 16 or 20 of them might vanish altogether. The tenants who occupied those cottages died, and their heirs died, and the priest who might have registered their deaths died, and the lord who might have collected the entry fine on the vacant tenancy was often dead himself, or too pressed by his own troubles to pursue the matter. In a monastery of 30 monks, 5 might remain. In a family of 12 there is a record from the diocese of Ely of a rector who buried his entire parish, and then, in the customary phrase, went the way of all flesh himself, leaving no one to bury him but the reeve of the neighbouring ville, who came over the next week to see why the bells were not being rung. This was the country into which Alice Perez was very probably born. The exact date of her birth is not known and cannot now be recovered, but the balance of scholarly opinion places it somewhere between about 40 and 48, which is to say, either just before the first sweeping plague, or during it, or in the strange thin seasons immediately after. It is a birth date that hides itself in the general erasure of records from those years. Baptismal registers of any completeness did not yet exist here. Parish books, where they were kept at all, were kept for tithes and for the customary dues of the manor court, not for the lives of ordinary infants. If her parents were of the yeomanry or the minor gentry, they would perhaps have expected a chronicler of the kin, only if that kin was of some note, and her kin, whoever they were, was not of note. So she enters her days in a silence that was, in her time, the ordinary silence of most people. Yet the country she entered was not ordinary. It was one that had been shaken loose from itself. When perhaps a third of a country's people die within 18 months, the arrangements of that country do not remain what they were. Labour, which had been abundant and cheap and easily coerced through the customary obligations of villeinage, became scarce and expensive and difficult to command. A ploughman, who in the year 45 might have accepted his father's holding and his father's wages accepted a decade on, higher wages, or moved to a neighbouring manor where higher wages could be had, or moved to a town where the guilds were desperate for hands, or accepted a tenancy his kin could never before have hoped to hold, because there was no other applicant. The old rents were not paid. The old dues were not collected. The old certainties, by which a man knew what he was owed and what he owed in return, were shaken and, in many places, quietly abandoned. The administration of Edward III attempted, from 49 onward, to hold the line. The Ordinance of Labourers of that autumn and the Statute of Labourers of 51 tried to fix wages and prices at their pre-plague levels and to compel the labouring poor to serve any employer who would offer them work at those levels. These statutes were in practice unenforceable. They were enforced enough to be resented. A considerable number of prosecutions clogged the sessions rolls of the 50s, but not enough to reverse the underlying economics. Wages continued to rise. Peasants continued to move. The habit of deference to one's betters, which had been the invisible weave of the old order, began in certain quiet ways. Among the many consequences of this fraying was a new and unfamiliar mobility. A daughter born in obscurity in 1340 might, in the ordinary running of the pre-plague world, have expected to die in obscurity. She would have married a man of her father's standing, if she married at all, and lived out her days within a few days' walk of her birthplace, and left no trace in the historical record beyond, perhaps, a single entry in a manorial roll noting the payment of a marriage fine to the lord. But the plague had opened certain doors that had previously been closed, and had thinned the ranks of those who might have kept them shut. It became possible, in a way that it had not quite been possible before, for the daughter of a small yeoman, or a minor merchant, or an obscure clerk, to find her way, through service, into a great house, and from there, if the currents of chance and character carried her that way, into places that would once have been unimaginable. It is important not to overstate this. The society, after the plague, was not a levelled society. It remained an age of intense and formal hierarchy of duty and blood and precedence, of ranks preserved by sumptuary law and by the disapproval of neighbours. But it was an age in which the mortar between the stones had, in certain places, softened. And it is into a softened place that Alice Perez seems to have moved. At the top of that arrangement, in the seasons of her childhood and early youth, sat Edward III. He was, by the middle of the 50s of that century, a monarch in the fullness of his powers. He had come to the throne as a boy of 14 in 27, after the deposition and murder of his father, and he had spent his first regnal seasons as a puppet of his mother, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. In 30, at 17, he had thrown down that regime by force and taken his kingship into his own hands, and he had gripped it firmly ever since. He had married Philippa of Hainaut in 28, and by 55 she had borne him a dozen offspring, most of whom lived to adulthood. A rare and impressive fertility for the era. He had begun the long war with France that would eventually be called the 100 Years' War, and around her likely birth he was winning it. Sluys in 40, Crecy in 46, Calais in 47. He was tall and blonde and physically imposing, and his court, when he was on this side of the sea, was one of tournaments and pageantry, of a chivalric society, and a self-conscious project of crown magnificence. This was the destination toward which Alice's course, unbeknown to her and to those around her, was carrying her. She would not enter that court as a lady of high blood, because she had none. She would not enter it as a foreign princess, because she was not foreign. She would enter it, if she entered it at all, through the servants' door, as one of the many young attendants whose function was to attend the ladies of the Queen, to sew and to fetch, and to walk in procession, and to keep quiet in the presence of the powerful. That was the customary route, and there was nothing extraordinary about the route itself. What was extraordinary was where, in her case, it led, but to see where it led, we must first see where she came from, and we must confront the strange truth that even now, nearly 700 years after her birth, we do not know for certain where that was. There is a peculiar difficulty in beginning the biography of a figure whose beginnings cannot be securely known. It is a difficulty familiar to the historians of pre-modern female subjects in general, who must often work from an absence of records, but it is unusually severe in her case. She enters the record fully formed in her middle 20s, receiving crown gifts. Before that moment there is almost nothing. No baptismal entry, no credible naming of her parents, no documented siblings, no secure birthplace. She is, in the phrase of one modern student, someone who seems to have been invented at the moment of her arrival at court. She was not invented, of course. She had a childhood and parents and a place of birth, and probably some kind of instruction in reading and estate management, because when she does emerge, she is transacting business with a competence that suggests she had not learned it at court. But the particulars of that earlier existence were either never recorded or have been lost, and the gap has been filled over the centuries by hypothesis, by inference, and by a certain amount of confident invention on the part of those with theories to advance. The chroniclers who wrote in her lifetime, and shortly after, had their own answer, which was that she was low-born and disreputable. Thomas Walsingham, the St. Albans chronicler, who is the most vivid and least fair of her contemporary describers, called her the daughter of a tiler from the village of Henny in Essex, a creature, as he put it, of humble birth and shameless conduct. The Anonymal Chronicle, a Yorkshire compilation of similar date, offers a comparable picture: obscure origins, no lineage worth speaking of, elevated through the sovereign's disgraceful attachment. These accounts have the advantage of being nearly contemporary. They have the disadvantage of being written by men who had strong reasons to represent her as unworthy of the place she had attained, because a person of good birth in her standing would have been a different kind of scandal, one that implicated the entire nobility rather than merely the sovereign's private weakness. Modern scholarship has largely rejected the tiler's daughter story, or at least declined to accept it as more than gossip. The version has the shape of a moral fable rather than a fact. Almost every early denunciation of a low-born mistress in late medieval Anglo writing calls her the daughter of some contemptible artisan: a tanner, a baker, a butcher, a tailor. And the choice of trade tells us more about the rhetorical purposes of the writer than about the ancestry of its subject. What we can say is that Alice was not of the higher nobility, because a subject of that station would have left records of the kind that magnate lineages kept, and that she was not of the servile peasantry, because a claimant of that station would not have moved as quickly and as effectively through the property markets as she would soon be moving. Her origins lie somewhere in the middle: the yeomanry, the minor gentry, perhaps a merchant kin of modest wealth, and some London connections. The surname itself is not a straightforward guide. She appears in the documents variously as Alice Perez, sometimes as de Perez, and after her marriage as de Windsor. Whether the first was a kin name or a place name is not settled. There was a Perez lineage with modest lands in Hertfordshire and Essex in the medieval period, and modern scholars, most influentially W. Mark Ormrod, in his careful reconstruction of her story, have argued that she was probably connected to this line, though not necessarily as a direct daughter of any of the men whose names we happen to know. She may have been born into it. She may have married into it in an earlier undocumented union before she came to court. She may have adopted the name for reasons that are now opaque to us. The historian who insists on certainty here will only mislead the reader. A more productive line of inquiry has focused not on her ancestors, but on her connections. Ormrod's work, drawing on wills, probate records, and property transactions, has argued that she was probably associated with a network of London merchants, goldsmiths, and mercers with wealth enough to place a bright young kinswoman in service in a leading establishment. The goldsmith John of London appears in some documents that plausibly relate to her. Other names, including a possible early husband named Janin, hover in the papers in ways that are suggestive but not conclusive. If this reconstruction is right, then she was born into the London commercial class. Not humble in the poorest way, but not gentle either, with sufficient education to make herself useful, and sufficient connections to be introduced into the Crown's service. There is another possibility, which Ormrod has also carefully considered, that Alice was born into, or married into, the establishment of one of Queen Philippa's own attendants, and entered the Crown circle through the customary mechanism of aristocratic sponsorship. Philippa's chamber was staffed by attendants, who had come with her from Hainaut, others drawn from the Anglo nobility, and lesser members brought in through the patronage of the greater. A young attendant of modest but respectable background, placed in the Queen's service by a well-disposed sponsor, would have had the opportunity to be noticed by the sovereign in the regular course of daily existence at court. This is the mechanism by which a good many crown mistresses in a good many centuries have come to their standing. It is undramatic and quite likely. Whatever her precise route, we must picture her, in the middle 60s, as a young attendant in the Queen's service. She was probably in her early 20s. She was probably not extraordinarily beautiful in the manner that the chroniclers, who tended to describe crown mistresses either as sirens or as hags, would have recognised. Walsingham, indeed, is at pains to insist that she was not beautiful. A curious claim, given his general hostility, which some students have read as a backhanded admission that her hold on the sovereign was not merely physical, and therefore was more dangerous than mere physical attraction would have been. She could read and write. This is clear from the sophistication of her later property dealings. She could probably speak the Anglo-Norman French of the court as well as English. She was observant and cool-headed, and evidently possessed of the particular talent required to make herself, over a period of years, indispensable to a man in his 50s who was becoming increasingly lonely. To speak of her origins is really to speak of what origins meant for a female principal of the era. For a man of any station, they were partially escapable. Through the church, through the university, through military service, through commerce, a man could rise in principle beyond the station of his birth. For his sister, origins were more fixed. She was, in law and in social expectation, defined by the men to whom she was related, her father, her husband, her sons. Anyone who lacked those relations, or lacked them at the right social level, had very few resources with which to make her own way. Alice, in this respect, was an exception. She did make her own way, but she could only do so by finding a form of leverage that the everyday structures did not provide, and that leverage, for her, was the personal favour of a sovereign. We will see, over the following chapters, how she used that leverage and what it cost her, but we should not begin without recognising that the ambiguity of her origins is not an accident of poor record-keeping. It is a feature of the kind of existence she led. She was a subject for whom the received categories did not fit, and the standard documents did not know how to describe. That she was born, that she grew, that she found her way to court. These things are certain. The rest is the historian's patient work with fragments, and the fragments will not, in the end, form an entire picture. They will only form a picture full enough to begin. The palace culture that Alice entered in the middle 60s was, in its outward appearance, one of the most splendid in Christendom. Edward III had spent nearly 4 decades building it into an instrument that combined military prestige, chivalric self-presentation, and elaborate ceremonial polish. It had a physical geography, moving between a modest number of favoured residences. Windsor Castle, high above the Thames west of London, remodelled at enormous expense in the 50s and 60s to serve as the ceremonial heart of the Order of the Garter. The Palace of Westminster, downriver from the city, where assemblies met and the affairs of state were transacted. Sheen, a rambling riverside manor upstream of London, which the sovereign increasingly preferred as he grew older. And Havering at a Bower in Essex, one of the Queen's houses, where much of the domestic existence of the throne's kin took place. There were more: Woodstock, Eltham, the Tower. But these four made up the regular circuit. The travelling court was in one aspect the domestic circle of a family: the king, the queen, their surviving children, and the intimate personal servants required to keep crown existence in motion. In another aspect, it was the working government of England, because the sovereign was the government, and his rooms travelled with him. The senior officers of state, the chancellor, the treasurer, the keeper of the privy seal, the steward of the household, the chamberlain, were officers of that inner circle, and their clerks and under-secretaries followed them from residence to residence, along with the wagons and pack-horses that carried the archives and the treasure. In a third aspect, this moving court was a social organism, a place where the leading magnates and their retainers came to be seen and to see, to press suits and to arrange weddings and to observe the shifting weight of favour among their peers. Presiding over all this in the seasons around her arrival was a monarch in his mid-50s. He had been born in 12. By 65 or 66, when Alice most probably enters the everyday field of his notice, he was 53 or 54, an age at which a man of his station was ordinarily reckoned to be near the end of his active existence, though the sovereign would, in fact, live another decade. He was, by all accounts, still an imposing figure, tall, well-built, with the fair hair of his Plantagenet forebears grown grey at the temples. He was a competent ruler, still fully in command of his faculties, though his habits had grown more domestic and his temper less certain than they had been in his younger seasons. The sizable wars in France had reached, with the Treaty of Bretigny in 60, a kind of pause. He had renounced his claim to the French throne in exchange for full sovereignty over an enlarged Aquitaine, and Anglo arms were, for the moment, at rest. It was a peaceful court, or as peaceful as one of that scale could be. Beside him was Philippa. She had come to England in 27 as a young woman of 13, betrothed to a slightly younger sovereign, and she had been, by every measure, the outstanding personal success of his reign. She had borne him 12 or 13 offspring, of whom 7 had reached adulthood: Edward the Black Prince, Isabella, Lionel of Antwerp, John of Gaunt, Edmund of Langley, Mary, and Thomas of Woodstock. A fertility so exceptional in a princely union that some observers regarded it as evidence of God's approval of the sovereign's rule. She had been a figure of visible warmth, credited by chroniclers with the moderating role in a number of the king's harsher decisions, most famously in her celebrated intervention on behalf of the burghers of Calais in 47. Her presence had shaped the court around her. It had been, in tone, a place of domestic life, as much as of chivalric magnificence, softened by her steady modesty. But by the middle 60s, Philippa was ill. She had suffered a fall from a horse many seasons earlier, and in the time since her health had steadily declined. Contemporary references speak of her difficulty in walking, of her withdrawal from the more strenuous public functions, of extended stays at Windsor and Havering, while the monarch moved about his other business. She was overweight. The fine tomb effigy that survives at Westminster Abbey, based on a life model, records her as she was in her final illness, and troubled by what may have been dropsy, or perhaps a chronic heart condition. The diagnoses of the era do not translate well. Whatever the precise cause, she was in her last seasons a consort whose visible role at court was contracting around her. Philippa's establishment retained its structure. There were her ladies-in-waiting, drawn from the wives and daughters of the leading nobility, attendants whose duty it was to sit with the consort in her private rooms, to accompany her on public occasions, to entertain her, to nurse her, to keep her company through the long private hours of the day. Below them was a second layer, damsels of the chamber, younger attendants of gentler but more modest rank, whose duties were more practical. Below them still was a third layer, servants proper, who did the physical work of laundry and dressing and cleaning and fetching. It was somewhere in the middle of this arrangement, most probably as a damsel of the inner household, that she first appears. Around Philippa's rooms stood the sovereign's own establishment, larger and more visible: the chamberlains, the ushers, the yeomen of the crown, the sergeants at arms, the retained knights. And around the two together stood the leading nobility. In the middle 60s, these included John of Gaunt, the king's fourth surviving son, now in his mid-20s, already the wealthiest magnate in England through his union with Blanche of Lancaster, his older brother, the Black Prince, ruling in Aquitaine, but frequently in touch. William Wykeham, the rising ecclesiastical statesman, soon to become Bishop of Winchester and Chancellor. Simon Sudbury, another rising cleric, and a supporting cast of earls, bishops, and household officials whose names would recur through Alice's story. William Latimer, John Neville of Raby, Richard Lyons, Adam Berry. Into this arena, a young attendant without name or kin behind her had almost nothing with which to make a mark. But the household, for all its formal hierarchy, was also a place of physical proximity. The king walked its corridors, he ate in its halls, he hunted in its parks, he read his letters in its inner rooms. And when the queen was too ill to travel or to attend, he travelled and attended alone or with only his personal retinue. In such an environment, a young attendant of the queen's household, quiet, observant, useful, patient, could become known to the sovereign in the quiet way that human beings become known to one another. There was no need for a dramatic introduction. The introduction happened over months and seasons of daily existence. We do not know when or how the aging king first began to notice Alice in a way that was different from his notice of the others, who moved about his consort. We can only observe that at some point in the middle 60s, he did. And the establishment, which had been for so long the ordered domestic circle of a settled sovereign's kin, began, very quietly, to shift its shape around a new fact that had not yet been named. The first documented reference to her by name occurs in the consort's household accounts for the year 66. It is a modest entry, the kind of routine bookkeeping notation that fills the wardrobe rolls of every princely establishment, and it records that she, one of the damsels of Philippa's chamber, received 2 tons of Gascon wine as a gift from her sovereign. 2 tons was a considerable present. A ton held roughly 250 gallons. 2 of them would have been more wine than a person of Alice's ostensible station could plausibly consume in a 12-month or even in several. It was, in effect, a transferable asset. She could sell it, exchange it, use it as security. The gift was, in that sense, not merely a token of favour, but a piece of practical value handed into her keeping. The gift is also striking for its date. It falls 3 years before Queen Philippa's death, at a moment when the Queen was still, formally, the presiding figure of her own household. The Crown was making, at the head of his wife's establishment, a personal grant of significant material worth to one of her attendants. This was not unusual in itself. Sovereigns gave gifts to the members of the consort's household routinely, at Christmas, at New Year, at the marriages and confinements of the great, on the anniversaries of victories. But there are gifts, and the tons of wine to Alice were of a kind and scale that suggests something more than the seasonal generosity a monarch ordinarily distributes. More significant still is the entry in the wardrobe accounts of 68, in which she is recorded as receiving jewels from the sovereign's own store. Again, the value is considerable. A set of pieces whose combined worth ran into the tens of pounds at a time when a skilled craftsman might earn 6 pence a day. These were not trinkets. They were the kind of ornaments that a queen would wear on ceremonial occasions, or that a wealthy widow of the higher nobility might list in her will as her chief treasures. For a damsel in Philippa's inner rooms to be receiving such things from her monarch was, to any observer who knew the customs of the court, a signal. There is a further set of records from the same period. Patent rolls entering 68 and running through 69 that show her receiving grants of manors. The first was a modest one in Nottinghamshire, followed by charters for properties in Hertfordshire, Essex, and, before long, in a widening circle of counties across the eastern half of England. These awards were made by charter, sealed with the Great Seal, and enrolled in the customary way of transfers to the sovereign's servants. They differed from the standard run of such benefactions only in one respect, which is that the ones to her were unusually large and unusually frequent, and were made to a figure who had, so far as anyone could tell, no obvious claim on his generosity except her station at Philippa's court. The historian must ask, as those around the throne would have asked, what these gifts signal. There is a level at which they signal nothing more than personal generosity. A monarch might reward a servant who had been useful to his wife, or to himself in some minor capacity, without any particular romantic implication. There were plenty of ladies at his court who received gifts and rewards of one kind or another over the years, without becoming his mistresses. The difficulty is that the gifts to her, cumulatively, exceed the pattern of routine reward. They were not one-off tokens on the occasion of some event. They were a continuous stream, mounting in value, extending across years, and involving in each instance a personal decision by the king. Beyond a certain threshold, in a court in which every royal act was noted and interpreted, generosity becomes political. A lady of the Queen's household known to be receiving from the throne was one on whom others would begin to press their suits, hoping that she might carry them to him. Any figure who could carry suits to the sovereign was, thereby, in possession of a form of power. The gifts in this way both created and confirmed a position, the position of intimate access. Whether or not the physical relationship had begun, it happened. The political relationship was becoming visible. We should attend closely to the mechanism. The sovereign did not issue an announcement. He did not make a public speech identifying Alice as his particular favourite. What he did, over a series of quiet acts recorded in the routine bureaucratic hand of his clerks, was to redirect a stream of resources in her direction. The court read the redirection and adjusted its behaviour accordingly. Chamberlains attended more carefully when she passed. Ushers admitted her more readily to inner rooms. Petitioners found ways to be introduced. The transformation was gradual and would have been almost imperceptible from month to month, but from season to season it was undeniable. There is one further class of transfers that deserves attention. In 70, Alice received custody of the manor of Wendover in Buckinghamshire on generous terms. That is, she was appointed to manage it and to take its revenues during a span of crown control. Custody was not the same as outright ownership. It was a form of office holding, a delegation of the sovereign's authority to a servant to administer property on his behalf. But it was profitable. The custodian could take a share of what the manor produced, and it required, in whoever held the office, some competence in the management of lands. That she was being trusted with such a charge suggests that whoever was making the decision, and it was, in the end, the king himself, considered her capable of the work. It is worth pausing on this, because it complicates the picture of a young woman rewarded solely for her personal charms. The gifts of wine and jewels could be assigned to affection. The grants of manors to hold in her own right could be assigned to lavish sentiment. But the awards of custody assumed practical ability. They assumed she could handle receipts and disbursements, could deal with bailiffs, could supervise the working of a manor at a distance. That she was being given such responsibilities so early suggests that the monarch, who had a lifetime's experience of judging competence in his servants, had judged her competent. The chronicler Froissart, writing later, gives us our first outside description of her from about this time. He calls her belle et jolie, attractive and lively, and refers to her as one of the Queen's damsels. He does not use the language of scandal that the Anglo chroniclers would later use. His French detachment and his distance from the immediate court politics of the 70s gives his portrait a somewhat cooler quality. He suggests that the widower monarch found in her a personal companionship that his declining consort could no longer provide, and that the courtiers around him accepted this as one of the ordinary accommodations of a magnate's establishment. By the end of 68, Alice was a figure of some substance. She had jewels, she had wine, she had manners held in her own right, she had custody of others, she had regular access to Edward. She was still, formally, a servant of the Queen, and would remain so until Philippa's death. But the ground beneath that formal standing was shifting. What had begun as private favour was becoming, month by month, a public fact. The next great event of the reign, the death of the Queen, would resolve that ambiguity in a direction from which there would be no returning. Philippa of Hainaut died at Windsor Castle on the 15th of August, 69. She was in her middle 50s and had been visibly ill for some years. The immediate cause was a lingering illness, most probably the same chronic condition that had confined her progressively to her chamber over the preceding decade, and her passing was neither sudden nor unexpected. It had, in the phrase of the chroniclers, been long feared. Edward was with her when it happened. She died, according to Froissart, having asked from him 3 final favours: that he would pay her debts, that he would keep the promises she had made to religious houses, and that when the time came, he would be buried beside her at Westminster. He is said to have wept and to have granted all 3, and to have observed the promises, so far as circumstances allowed. The elaborate double tomb that now stands in Westminster Abbey, where his effigy lies beside hers, is the final honouring of the 3rd promise, though he would not be laid there for another 8 years. The passing of a consort was an event of national significance. Philippa's funeral was of a magnificence appropriate to her station. Her body was brought from Windsor to London in state, lay in ceremonial rest, and was interred at Westminster with the full rites of the Church and the presence of every principal figure of the realm who could be gathered on short notice. The chroniclers dwelt at length on her virtues, her modesty, her charity, her devotion to her husband, her fecundity, and Froissart, in particular, composed a set piece of loving grief around her memory. She had been, in ways that were not always obvious in her lifetime, one of the essential figures of the reign. Her presence had held the palace together. Her personal charities had softened the sharper edges of the government. Her diplomatic instincts, learned in the compact quarrelling arena of Hainaut, had proved useful in the broader quarrelling arena of England. For the monarch, her passing was a personal wound of a kind that his reign had not yet delivered. He had lost children. His eldest daughter Isabella had recovered. His daughter Joan had died of plague in 48 on her way to Castile for her wedding. His son William had died in infancy. But he had not before lost the figure to whom he was most closely bound. He was 56 years old. He had reigned for 42 years. He had, in Philippa, the fixed point of his adult life. Now that point was gone. For the palace, her passing was an organisational event. The Queen's establishment had been a lawful entity distinct from her husband's, with its own officers, its own accounts, its own residences. When Philippa died, that establishment did not immediately cease to exist. The arrangements for winding it up would take many months, and some of its officers would remain on the payroll long enough to see the estate through probate, but its function was ended. Its members, including its damsels of the chamber, had to be provided for. Some were transferred to the establishments of the king's daughters or daughters-in-law. Some retired into the country. Others remained around the palace in less well-defined capacities. She stayed, and her position, in the months following the Queen's passing, changed character. What had been a private favour that carried on within the ordinary framework of the Queen's establishment now became a public arrangement that stood on its own. She was no longer a damsel of the Queen's private rooms, because there was no Queen and no such position to occupy. She was a companion attached directly to the widowed sovereign, whose role was defined only by his continued attention to her. The chroniclers noticed, the bureaucrats noticed, the leading magnates noticed, and the volume of gifts and rewards to her did not diminish. It swelled. Between 69 and 72, the patent rolls document an intensifying stream of favour toward her. She was granted the manor of Wendover in her own right, having previously held it in custody, and additional manors in Berkshire and Cambridgeshire. She was assigned rents from Crown estates. She received licenses to acquire additional properties by purchase. She was pardoned various technical debts and obligations that had been outstanding against estates she had already acquired. The pattern is one of a figure being financially established at a level that would let her operate independently for the rest of her life. Froissart's account of these years is worth citing at some length, because it is the first sustained description of her by a serious writer. He notes that the widowed sovereign, not wishing to marry again out of respect for his late consort's memory, took his consolations where he could, and that the chief of these was the company of a lady of the Queen's chamber named Alice, who was young and quick and well-liked. He describes her as having a natural adeptness in the management of the sovereign's affairs, as being trusted by him in matters of business, and as being resented by some of the older nobility for her closeness to the throne. He does not accuse her of vices. He presents her as a plain human figure in an extraordinary situation. The Anglo chroniclers, when they came to write, would give a different account. But it is important to note that Froissart was writing from within the circle of continental European courts, from a perspective that was accustomed to the routine presence of crown mistresses in the lives of sovereigns. And that saw in her something which would have been visible in a dozen additional capitals of the era without special scandal. The scandal in England would come from a specifically Anglo combination of factors: the aftermath of Philippa's beloved reign, the political tensions that would develop as the war with France resumed and went badly, and the peculiar Anglo chronicle tradition's readiness to see in any female principal near the throne a figure of moral danger. There is one more feature of the period after Philippa's passing that deserves attention. The widowed sovereign, freed from the presiding presence of his consort, did not become in any meaningful way a debauched figure. He continued to govern, he continued to preside over his council, he continued to attend the sittings that met from time to grant him supplies for the resumption of the French war. His personal days became simpler and more concentrated. He spent longer periods at Sheen, which became his preferred residence. He travelled less. He saw his greater nobles less often. In the reduced circle of his daily existence, she occupied a large place. What the palace would come to notice, in the first seasons of the 70s, was that the aging king's daily existence was becoming increasingly restricted, and that the figure who was increasingly present within it was Alice. To speak of her as an attendant who was given vast quantities of land by an infatuated monarch is to miss something important about how she operated. She was given some land, certainly, and the initial base of her fortune was crown generosity. But the pattern of her portfolio, taken together and studied over the seasons in which it grew, reveals something more interesting. She was an active investor. She bought as well as received. She sold and exchanged. She combined parcels, adjusted boundaries, used intermediaries, deployed lawyers, contested titles, and pursued profits with a consistency of intent that argues considered strategy rather than opportunistic drift. She acted, in short, like a considerable landowner of any age, with the significant caveat that she did so in a lawful system that made no easy allowance for her. The Anglo land law of the medieval era was a system of extraordinary complexity elaborated by generations of crown courts, statutes, and common practice into a network of overlapping tenures, obligations, and remedies. The dominant tenure was still in principle feudal. Land was owed to a lord in exchange for service, and ultimately all soil was owed to the throne. But the actual practice of possessing, transferring, and profiting from land had drifted well away from the simple picture of a knight owing military service for his fee. By the 70s, most acreage was kept in the elaborate variants of freehold that the pleaders had developed: fee simple, fee tail, life estate, remainder, reversion, and could be transferred by a variety of instruments: deed, foffment, final concord, license to alienate. For any of her sex to transact in this system was not impossible, but it was complicated. The doctrine of coverture folded a wife's business into her husband's, so that in the routine machinery of the courts, she had no independent voice. A widow had more room to move, and a never-married daughter had in theory the standing of a femme sole. The finer contours of these doctrines we shall pause over in a later hour when the account turns toward the thematic. For now it is enough to say that the paperwork of a portfolio the size Alice would soon build was a heavy load for anyone, and heavier still for one whose sex the courts were not designed to trust. She, in the early 70s, was, so far as we can tell, unmarried. This meant that she was, technically, competent to act on her own. But the practical difficulties of one of her sex acting on her own in the property market were considerable. She would need to use male attorneys and agents to handle much of the routine business. She would need to secure inferments through trustees, because such actors were often excluded from certain kinds of instruments. She would need to purchase licenses for any transaction that involved land in chief from the Crown. The paperwork required to build a sizable portfolio was enormous, and it required either exceptional personal competence or the ability to hire and manage competent counsel. Alice appears, from what we can see in the record, to have had both. The technique that appears most consistently in her transactions is the use of feoffment to uses, a legal device by which land was formally granted to trustees, called feoffees, who kept it on behalf of a beneficiary. The device had originally developed for a number of practical reasons: to evade certain feudal incidents, such as wardship, to facilitate wills of land in a system that did not otherwise permit them, to arrange settlements upon marriage. But it had a secondary utility that she exploited efficiently. It allowed the true beneficial owner of the land to remain, in the public record, hidden behind the names of trustees. A parcel granted to her use, but recorded in the names of a group of feoffees, would appear in the public rolls as belonging to those trustees. Her own connection to it would be documented only in private trust deeds, which might or might not survive to be found. The pattern is visible across a wide range of counties: in Hertfordshire, in Essex, in Berkshire, in Buckinghamshire, in Oxfordshire, in Nottinghamshire, in Wiltshire. Her name appears, sometimes overtly and sometimes hidden behind trustees, as the true owner of a growing collection of manors, rents, and rights. Some of these were royal grants. The king had given her a considerable number of estates outright, or in the form of leases for life with reversion to the throne, or as heritable awards that would descend to her offspring. Additional parcels were purchased with the wealth that flowed from her standing, from the fees she was paid for procuring favours, from the revenues of the holdings she already owned, from the loans she extended to those who wanted her intervention above. The scale of what she was building was, by the middle 70s, considerable. She kept, at one point or another, over the course of the decade, at least 50 manors. Some scholarly estimates run to more. She was drawing income streams from several times that number of subsidiary parcels: rents, tolls, mill dues, market rights. She was on the reckoning of some modern students, one of the wealthiest non-noble figures in the realm, and she was administering the entire apparatus through a compact circle of councilmen, whose names appear repeatedly as her faithis, her attorneys, her mainperners, and one may reasonably infer, through her own careful reading of the documents and understanding of the transactions, there was, in all of this, a shrewd anticipation of the future. She was building up fortune not as personal treasure, but as something more resilient, as land kept in trust, spread across counties, difficult for any single political enemy to strip from her. She was creating, deliberately and with considered foresight, a base of independent economic power that could survive the loss of the sovereign's favour. That base would be tested and tested repeatedly in the seasons that followed, and it would prove, as she must have hoped it would, more durable than her opponents expected. The private existence of Alice Perez, insofar as it can be reconstructed at all, was ordered around three principal facts that the surviving records will support. She bore children by Edward III. She was married, at some point, to a soldier and administrator named William de Windsor, and the sequence and dating of these events remains, in significant particulars, uncertain. Of the children, 3 are attributed with reasonable confidence: a son, John de Southeray, and 2 daughters, Joan and Jane. The exact dates of their births are not securely known, but they are usually placed in the later 60s and the earliest seasons of the 70s of the century. John de Southeray, the eldest and the only son to leave a durable trace in the records, was probably born around 64, though some scholars would push the date to 67 or 68. Whatever the year, he was young enough in the middle years of the 70s to be still under formal wardship, and old enough by 77 to be knighted at the coronation of Richard II. The ceremony at which young men of great houses were traditionally given their spurs. The 2 daughters are less well documented. Joan appears to have been married to a knight named Robert Skerne, whose family held lands in Kingston upon Thames. She appears in later records as Joan de Windsor, taking the name of her mother's husband rather than her father's. Jane, or Jan, is attested chiefly through property references and appears to have married into a landed family of similar standing. Both daughters carried land settlements from their mother's estate. Neither had a career of independent note. Their lives were, in the customary manner of daughters of well-provisioned widows, quiet, marriages, children, provisions for old age. That Edward III acknowledged these 3 as his is not in doubt. The formal grants of estates for their support, the household provisions made for John de Southeray in particular, and the ceremonial recognition at Richard II's coronation all point to a paternity that was openly recognised, if not officially declared. There was no medieval equivalent of the later formal creation of royal bastards as ducal peers, the elaborate rehabilitation that would eventually be extended to John of Gaunt's Beaufort issue by Catherine Swynford. But there was a working recognition that these were his own, entitled to the sort of provision the king would typically make for such offspring. The complication is the union with William de Windsor. Alice was at some point married to him. The date of the wedding is not securely known, and the question of whether it took place before or after the sovereign's death has been debated by generations of historians. The traditional view, taken from the chronicles and repeated in older histories, was that she married him secretly during the sovereign's lifetime, without his knowledge, a deception that scandalized the court when it was discovered. The modern view, articulated most cautiously by Ormrod and others, is that the wedding probably occurred earlier than the traditional account allowed, that the aging monarch probably knew about it, and that the arrangement served practical purposes for all parties. The practical purposes are worth setting out. William de Windsor was a knight of respectable but not aristocratic background. His family had lands in Westmoreland, in the far north of England, and he had made his early career in military and administrative service, most notably in Ireland. He was not a great magnate, He was not particularly wealthy, but he was capable, well connected in a professional way, and this was the point. He was male. A figure in Alice's position, however wealthy she became, required, in the customary running of the medieval world, a male protector who could stand in the public places on her behalf. A husband was that protector by definition. He could sue in the courts on her behalf. He could carry her estates without the encumbrances that a female claimant faced. He could raise armed men for her defense if needed. He could, in short, occupy the position that the world expected a wife's property to be attached to. He, for his part, gained a wife of considerable wealth, whose properties added enormously to what he might have accumulated on his own. He also gained, if he acted with any circumspection, some measure of protection through his connection to the throne. Whether he cared about the peculiar irregularity of marrying a woman still in an active relationship with her sovereign is not recorded. There is no reason to suppose he did. The pragmatism of the medieval nobility in such matters was considerable, and William was a pragmatic man. There is a reasonable body of scholarly opinion that would place the wedding in the early 70s, perhaps 72 or 73, with the understanding that Edward was aware of it and consented to it because it served his purposes as well as theirs. Alice would have a lawful protector when the sovereign was gone. Her offspring by the crown would have a stepfather of respectable standing. Her husband would have a bride whose wealth guaranteed his own security. What none of the parties would have been entirely comfortable with was the public advertisement of the arrangement, because it disrupted the accepted categories. Alice was, publicly and openly, Edward's woman, and it was awkward to be, simultaneously and formally, another man's spouse. So the union was kept quiet, not secret, but not proclaimed either. And its existence became controversial, precisely because the chroniclers, when they discovered it, could not decide whether to be scandalized by its concealment or by its very existence. His own career, in the early and middle 70s of the century, took him for extended periods to Ireland. He was appointed as the sovereign's lieutenant there in 69, and served 2 long spells in that office, 69 to 72, and again 73 to 76. Ireland was, at this stage of Anglo rule, a frontier of considerable difficulty. The Anglo settlements clung to the eastern coast and to a scattering of walled towns inland, and beyond them, the Gaelic lordships were reasserting themselves under a series of energetic princes. His mission was to keep what could be kept, to raise what revenue could be raised, and to prevent the entire enterprise from collapsing. He did the work, on the whole, competently, though it consumed enormous quantities of money and left him in constant fiscal difficulty. His absences meant that his wife, for much of the span of their union, was in effect operating as an independent principal in England, managing her own holdings, appearing in the courts through her own attorneys, and living in her own establishments. The children complicate the standard account. If John de Southeray was born in 64 or thereabouts, then Alice was, at that time, either not yet at court or newly arrived, and the sovereign's relationship with her must have begun earlier than the record's first public appearances suggest. This is not impossible. The surviving records are patchy, and any attendant might have caught the monarch's attention seasons before her name appeared in the wardrobe accounts. But it is unproven. If John de Southeray was born later, in 67 or 68, then the timing fits more naturally with the documented rise of Alice's position. The scholarship has not resolved the question, and probably cannot. What emerges from the tangle is not a scandal plot, but a pattern of considered planning. Alice was building not only a portfolio of properties, but a family. She was placing her children into arrangements that would give them futures. She was securing, in Windsor, a lawful partner who could stand, where she could not. She was doing, in short, what a figure of her competence and her lack of independent social standing was obliged to do if she wanted to leave behind, at the end of her days, more than the wreckage of her time in favour at court. It is the sort of practical arrangement that reads badly to chroniclers who wanted a morality tale, and reads sensibly to historians who have taken the trouble to look at what she actually did. The Anglo chroniclers of the 1400s were, in the main, monastic writers. They lived in the leading houses of the Church Stulbans, Westminster, the Anonymales Yorkshire compilations, the Northern Annals of Moe and elsewhere, and they wrote from within an established tradition with defined interests, and with settled literary conventions that shaped what they said. To read them well is to see both the events they describe and the framework through which they saw those events. It is above all important, in the case of Alice, to hold both in mind, because the chronicle portrait is what has come down to us most vividly, and it is also, in many respects, unreliable. The most influential of these writers, for our purposes, is Thomas Walsingham, St. Albans chronicler, whose sizable compilation, the Chronica Maiora, is the fullest surviving account of Anglo politics in the last third of the era. Walsingham wrote in Latin, with a considerable rhetorical facility and an even more considerable capacity for moral indignation. He was a monk of an established and wealthy abbey, whose lands and privileges depended on the crown's favour, but whose independence from the throne was one of its long-standing preoccupations. He was hostile to John of Gaunt for most of his career, was suspicious of Wycliffite religious opinions, and was consistently sceptical of the moral quality of the greater magnates. His portrait of Alice is one of the most sustained and vivid character studies of a female figure in Anglo-chronicle literature. It is also, on any careful reading, an act of literary construction. Walsingham's Mistress is a creature of humble birth and shameless ambition, who has bewitched the aged king through arts that the chronicler declines to specify but hints at darkly. She is described as physically unattractive, but personally magnetic, a combination that Walsingham treats as itself suspicious. She is accused of interfering with the routine processes of justice by sitting beside the Crown's judges at Westminster, in the very benches where the law was administered, and by influencing their decisions with her presence and her whispered representations. She is accused of using her closeness to enrich herself at the expense of the Treasury, of extracting fees for the delivery of grants, of monopolizing access to the sovereign. And she is accused, most notoriously, of having pulled the rings from the fingers of the dying monarch as he lay in his final agony before fleeing the palace to escape the consequences. Each of these accusations deserves separate examination. The claim of humble birth we have already seen to be at best unverifiable and probably a rhetorical flourish. The claim of physical unattractiveness combined with personal magnetism is a standard trope of the moralizing register. It appears in the descriptions of half a dozen additional crown mistresses in half a dozen further realms. The claim of sitting beside judges is more concrete and requires more careful consideration. Walsingham says that she attended sessions of the King's Bench at Westminster, taking her place at or near the justices, and pressed the causes of her clients. This is, on its face, an extraordinary allegation, because it implies a female principal participating in the formal administration of Crown justice in a way that no other figure of her era is otherwise recorded as doing. The modern reassessment of this charge, most rigorously advanced by Ormrod, has argued that it was probably an exaggeration of something less theatrical but more plausible. The sovereign, in the customary course of his reign, could and did direct his justices in particular matters, through writs, through informal instructions carried by his officers, through his attendance in person at hearings of individual political importance. If she, who had access to the aged monarch, was procuring such interventions on behalf of her clients. Then, what she was doing was intolerable to the chroniclers, not because it was formally unlawful, but because it operated through her. Because a female channel was being invoked to convey influence into the courts. The image of the mistress at the bench of the judges was a compressed and vivid symbol of a diffuse and much duller reality. The claim about the removal of the rings is different in character. It is a set piece, a scene of theatrical detail, offered by Walsingham with a novelist's confidence in its dramatic power. It is not corroborated by any other source of the period. It is not consistent with what the domestic accounts of the sovereign's last days suggest about who was present at his death. It has the structure of a piece of political propaganda deployed after the funeral to blacken the reputation of a lady who was already being politically dismantled by others. Modern historians, without asserting that Walsingham invented it out of nothing, generally treat it as an exaggeration or embellishment of some smaller episode, the mistress perhaps taking some personal effects she believed the aging monarch had promised her, being interpreted in a hostile reading as robbing him. The Anonymal Chronicle, a much more concise and briefer work compiled in Yorkshire, offers a similar overall portrait, but in a more restrained tone. It notes her presence at court, records the attacks upon her, and describes the ambient scandal of her position, but without the extended set pieces that Walsingham favoured. It is in some ways the more reliable guide, precisely because it says fewer things and asserts fewer things. The compilers of the Anonymal were interested in political events. They were not interested in composing character, portraits of a king's mistress. When they mention her, they do so in the course of describing something else. The picture that emerges is consistent with Walsingham's in broad outline, but without the same rhetorical charge. Behind all of these accounts stands a template. The powerful female principal in a monarch's court, in the chronicle tradition, is a creature of moral danger. She is the Eve who tempts, the Delilah who unmans, the Jezebel who corrupts. The template pre-existed her. It would be applied later to others. It was fewer an observation about her individual matter than a lens through which chroniclers were prepared to see any woman in her structural station. What the modern historian needs to do, and what recent scholarship has increasingly done, is to read past the template and to attend to what the chroniclers actually saw and reported when they were not moralizing. There is real material in Walsingham and the Anonymal, but it must be extracted with care. The assembly that gathered at Westminster on the 28th of April, 76, would be remembered by later generations as the Good Parliament, a name given it by contemporaries and preserved by the chroniclers as an unusual honorific. It was called good, not because its proceedings were dignified. They were, by the standards of 14th century assemblies, unusually rancorous, but because it accomplished something that had not been done before. It forced accountability upon the king's inner circle. It identified corrupt officials by name. It prosecuted them through a novel legal process, and it removed from court a modest number of individuals whose presence there had come to be regarded, by the Commons and by many of the Lords, as intolerable. Among those individuals was Alice Perez. The Parliament had been called for the usual reason that such gatherings were called. The Crown needed money. The war in France, which had entered a new and increasingly unfortunate phase since '69, was consuming resources at a rate the Crown could not sustain from its usual revenues. Charles V of France had proven a shrewder opponent than his father, and his commander Bertrand du Guesclin had, over the previous decade, methodically stripped the Anglo forces of most of the gains of the Treaty of Bretigny. The vast aquitaine that Edward had won at the treaty table was now shrinking back to a coastal strip. Gascon towns had fallen, Anglo armies had been ambushed and destroyed. The commercial disruption of the war was pressing on the mercantile classes, and Edward, who might in his younger years have led an army into France and repaired the damage by his own presence, was now too old and infirm to campaign. Into this space had rushed a number of figures whose management of the royal finances and of the king's grants and privileges had by 76 come to be seen as a source of enormous private profit and public loss. William Latimer, the king's chamberlain, was accused of extracting bribes for the release of royal grants and of enriching himself through fraudulent transactions on the throne's behalf. Richard Lyons, a London merchant, was accused of speculating in the debts owed by the Treasury, buying them up at a discount and cashing them at par to that Treasury's grievous injury. John Neville of Raby, the steward of the palace, was accused of related offences. Adam Berry, a merchant of Calais, was accused of financial irregularities in the wool trade, and she was accused of a variety of misdeeds that ranged from the trivial to the grave: interfering with justice, extracting fees for royal favours, hoarding fortune taken from the treasury, exercising undue influence over the aged monarch. The Assembly, when it convened, did something unusual. The Commons, the elected representatives of the counties and boroughs, took the lead in raising the grievances. They elected as their speaker, for the first time in a formal way that would set a precedent, a knight named Peter de la Mare, steward of the household of the Earl of March. De la Mare was a competent, austere, and determined man, willing to insist on the Commons' points against the pressure of the leading magnates. Under his leadership, the Commons presented their charges to the Lords and demanded action, and the Lords, most notably a coalition led by the Earl of March and the Black Prince, chose to hear them. The Black Prince Edward of Woodstock, the king's eldest son and heir, was by 76 terminally ill. He had contracted, on his Iberian campaigns of the late 60s, some chronic wasting condition that had returned periodically ever since. By the spring of that year he was dying, and he knew he was dying. His own son, the future Richard II, was a boy of 9. The stability of the succession was, in the prince's judgment, threatened by the state of the court in his father's declining years. He wanted the corruption identified and rooted out before he himself died, so that his son would inherit a purified court. His illness prevented him from attending the Parliament in person, but he attended by proxy and by influence, and his weight settled behind the Commons. Against this coalition stood John of Gaunt, the king's second surviving son, who was with the prince ill and his father incapacitated, effectively directing the crown's government. Gaunt, whose relationship with the men accused was complex, was reluctant to see any of them destroyed in a manner that established parliamentary precedents against the king's servants. He would spend the Parliament in a rearguard action, attempting to blunt the Commons' attacks, to secure lighter sentences, to preserve the essential principle that ministers were the thrones to appoint and dismiss. He was, on the whole, unsuccessful. The procedure by which the accused were tried was, by later terminology, the first use of impeachment in Anglo-parliamentary history. The Commons brought their charges to the Lords. The Lords sat as judges. The accused answered as defendants. William Latimer was condemned, imprisoned, and heavily fined. Richard Lyons was condemned, imprisoned, and had his goods confiscated. John Neville of Raby was condemned and lost his office. Adam Berry was condemned and fined. Her cause was different in one important respect. She was not a crown officer. She occupied no office of state. She was, formally, a private figure in the sovereign's establishment. The counts against her therefore had to be constructed differently. They took two forms. The first was a set of allegations about her past conduct, the alleged interference with justice, the extraction of fees, the improper acquisition of manors. The second was a proposed remedy, an ordinance requiring her to be removed from court, forbidding her from ever again coming into the king's presence, and threatening her with the loss of all her goods and lands if she disobeyed. The Commons passed such an ordinance. It was solemnly enacted with the sovereign's assent, an assent that observers understood to have been extracted under circumstances of political pressure, but that was, formally, freely given. The ordinance took effect. In the summer of that year, she withdrew from court, she retired to one of her manors, most probably Wendover or one of the other Buckinghamshire estates, and for a span of some months she disappeared from the public record. Her enemies believed, or affected to believe, that they had won. The Black Prince, having achieved the essential political goal of his last months, died on the 8th of June and was buried at Canterbury with the honours of a dead king in waiting. The assembly dissolved, the country returned to its usual business, and the ordinances of the assembly seemed to have taken lasting effect. They had not. By the autumn, she was back at court. The precise mechanism of her return is not clear from the records, but its outlines are visible. Gaunt, who now had a free hand with the prince dead and the parliament dispersed, reversed most of the earlier actions in a great council held at Westminster in October. He had Peter de la Mare arrested and imprisoned. He had William Latimer released and restored to the council. He had many of the ordinances declared void as having been passed under improper procedure. Alice, presumably by his connivance and by the king's own desire, was allowed to return to the sovereign's side. She had, according to Walsingham, sworn on the Gospels not to return. She returned anyway, and Walsingham marks the return as one of the outrages of the age. But the return was politically expensive. Alice had been publicly named. She had been publicly attacked. The Commons had established, however fragilely, the principle that a figure of her standing could be brought to account in the Assembly, and that principle would not go away. When the political weather shifted again, as it would within the year, the earlier charges would be revived, and she would find herself, once more, in the dock. Edward III, when he returned to what remained of his court in the autumn of 76, was a man visibly nearing the end of his days. He had been ill for some months during the sitting. Some sources have him confined to bed for most of the crisis, and although he recovered enough to preside, in a limited way, at the council that followed, he was neither the physical nor the mental figure he had been, even a year earlier. He was 64. He had suffered, some time in the previous seasons, what may have been a series of minor strokes. His speech was sometimes affected. His memory drifted between the immediate and the distant. He was subject to spells of confusion in which the shape of the room around him seemed fainter than the shape of some remembered scene from his younger days. He was still capable, at moments, of the shrewd assessment that had made him a formidable ruler in his prime, but the moments were shorter and further apart. He kept, in these final weeks, to a compact circle. He was mostly at Sheen, the riverside manor he had come to prefer above his additional houses. He was attended by a physician, one Master John of Gaddesden, or so tradition holds, by his confessor, by a handful of retainers and grooms, and by Alice, who was with him for most of the surviving weeks, and whose presence in his private rooms was recorded in the household ledgers, in a form that did not attempt concealment. The pretense that she had ever been anything else than what she was had, in this final phase, been quietly abandoned. She was his companion. She lived in his establishment. She ate at his table. She slept, when he slept, near enough to hear him if he called. There is a chronicle passage, again in Walsingham, of a distinctive set of arrangements made at Sheen in these weeks, elaborate provisions of clothing and jewelry for her, elaborate meals prepared for the two of them, elaborate quiet in the private apartments. The passage is coloured by Walsingham's characteristic disapproval, but its outlines fit what the surviving records confirm. The ageing sovereign, in his final weeks, wanted comfort. What she provided him, whatever combination of practical care, familiar company, and the memory of stronger years he wanted, and no one, in the aftermath of Gaunt's countercoup, was in a position to deny him. There were, through the winter into the spring of 77, brief attempts to rally. Another sitting was called in the January. It was a Gaunt-managed affair, the Commons packed with his allies. Peter Delamare, still in prison. No dissent tolerated. It granted the Crown the taxes it needed. It reversed such of the good Parliament's acts as had not already been reversed by Council. It confirmed Alice in her standing, or at least did not attack her further. From her perspective, it was as favourable an outcome as could reasonably have been hoped, and it bought her, for the moment, a further span of quiet security. Beyond the public calendar, the domestic calendar rolled forward. Christmas was kept quietly at Sheen. The new season was celebrated with the usual gifts among the retinue. A tournament of considerable splendour was held at Smithfield in the spring. In celebration of the young Prince Richard, now heir to the throne, after his father's passing, though the aged monarch himself was too weak to attend. The tournament was a set piece of chivalric magnificence. The sovereign's absence from it was noted. The chroniclers described the event as a farewell of the age. His decline through the spring was steady. He was attended, in his final weeks, by a compact circle from which most of the leading magnates had, by now, quietly withdrawn. Gaunt was much of the time at his own residences, though he was in reach. The Black Prince's widow, Joan, and her son Richard were kept at a distance, appropriate to the courtly situation. The lesser servants, knights, retainers, chaplains, stayed at Sheen. Alice stayed. Some of her feoffees and clerks came and went, dealing with property matters that had to be pushed through while the ageing sovereign was still capable of assenting to them. And the patent rolls of the early months record a further burst of grants and confirmations to Alice and to her associates that the historians have long noticed. Whatever else was happening in those weeks, the machinery of favour to Alice was working at full capacity. He died on the 21st of June 77. The exact circumstances of his passing are described most fully by Walsingham, and here we must return to the notorious scene of the rings. According to the chronicler, she was with him in his final hours. She had been much of that day at his bedside, and as he lapsed into the last stages, she, sensing the moment and considering only her own advantage, pulled the rings from his fingers and fled from the palace, leaving him alone in his end. The scene is described with a specificity intended to make it unforgettable, and it has been unforgettable. It is the image of her that has come down through the centuries in the school histories and the popular retellings. But the specificity should provoke suspicion. Walsingham was not at Sheen. He does not name a source who was. The chamberlains, chaplains, and physicians, whose duty it would have been to attend the dying monarch in his last hour, do not appear as witnesses to the ring-taking. Nor does the servant who prepared his body for the lying in state, nor does any officer of the wardrobe whose task it was to inventory the jewels that had rested on the sovereign's own body. The anonymal compilation passes over the scene entirely. The Westminster narrative, put together a few years later by a monk close to the court, makes no reference to any theft. Perhaps most tellingly, the enrolment of the Crown's own inventories in the months after the funeral does not record any complaint of missing regalia or personal jewellery. When the esquiters later assessed her forfeited possessions for the Crown, no ring formally of the sovereign's is mentioned among the items seized, A theft so brazen would ordinarily leave a paper trace of demand and recovery. The trace is absent. The likelihood is that Walsingham compressed some smaller matter, perhaps a keepsake she had been promised, perhaps a private token she carried away with earlier consent, into a scene shaped for readers who would recognise its literary shape at once. What we can say is that the aged sovereign died, that her presence at Sheen in the days before his passing is not in doubt, that she was not present at the state ceremonies of the days that followed. She would not, in any account, have been permitted to be, and that within days her public enemies were preparing the next round of attacks against her. The monarch who had shielded her from those attacks was gone. The regime that would succeed him would not, on any showing, extend her the same protection. And she must have known, in the quiet of whatever room she occupied on the evening of that June, that her span of security had ended. The funeral was held at Westminster in the last days of June. The body was carried in procession from Sheen through the London streets, lying in state under a rich pall, attended by his surviving sons and the great officers of the realm. He was buried beside Philippa, as he had promised her, on the 2nd of July. Richard, his grandson, now aged 10, was proclaimed king. The transition was, by the standards of medieval crown successions, smooth. The apparatus of government continued to operate. The judges continued to sit. The parliament that would meet in the autumn began to be organised, and in the middle of this bureaucratic continuation, the machinery of the state turned itself, quietly and deliberately, in Alice's direction. Alice's fall in the autumn of 77 was not a single dramatic event, but a series of juridical and administrative actions taken across several months. It began within days of the king's passing, when the council governing on behalf of the young Richard II moved, formally, to reactivate the Good Parliament's ordinance against her. It continued through the Assembly of October, the first sitting of the new reign, in which fresh charges were laid and further sanctions imposed. It extended through the winter and into 78, as the mechanisms of forfeiture and enforcement worked their way through the properties she had accumulated. And it ended, if it can be said to have ended at all, in a state of juridical exile in which she remained cut off from formal recognition for some years. The immediate action was the reactivation of the banishment. The prior Parliament had ordered her removal from court on pain of forfeiture. The Council of the previous October had suspended that ordinance. The King's passing in the June of 77 removed the reason for the suspension. In July and August of the same year, Richard's council dominated for the moment by a coalition of magnates who had opposed Gaunt's counter-coup and whose politics were nearer to those of the earlier assembly, declared the ordinance to be in force again. She was to withdraw from any place where the new monarch might be, was to give up any offices she still occupied about the throne, and was to prepare to answer to the assembly that would meet in the autumn. The assembly that met at Westminster in the autumn drew heavily on the same personnel who had sat the previous year. Peter de la Mare, freed from prison in the amnesty accompanying Richard's accession, was elected Speaker for a second time, an unusual continuity. The mood of the sitting was determined rather than triumphant. The men who took their benches understood that whatever action they resolved upon would have to be phrased so as to withstand the counter-pressures that had defeated their earlier resolves. Alice's name was raised at once in the sitting's petitions. She was, as she had been in the summer of 76, the most conspicuous of the private figures the sitting could name, and every clerk and burgess who spoke in that hall knew that her case would test whether the settlements this time reached could hold beyond the moment of their reading. She was, in the Parliament's judgment, condemned. The formal sentence was severe. She was declared perjured for having broken her oath of banishment. she was declared forfeit in all her goods and lands. She was forbidden from remaining in England, or, in some accounts, was ordered to withdraw to a specified region, though the geographical detail is not entirely clear from the records. Her grants from the Crown were, in principle, to be revoked. Her acquisitions in other counties were, in principle, to be seized. The apparatus of enforcement sheriffs, escheators, the officers of the Exchequer, was set in motion against her. In practice, the enforcement was patchy. Medieval English government, though comparatively effective for its period, was not a modern administrative state capable of executing complex forfeitures against a determined defendant with resources spread across a dozen counties. Sheriffs were often the friends or relatives of the parties whose property they were meant to seize. Escheators were open to persuasion. Local juries were reluctant to give findings that inconvenienced their neighbours, and she, as her opponents would discover, had made herself difficult to dislodge. Many of her holdings were kept not in her own name, but through the famacci as she had appointed. To reach them, the escheators would have to challenge each fuffment in turn. In the local courts, against opposing counsel supplied by her and by William de Windsor. The forfeitures dragged on for years. Some were carried through, many were quietly frustrated. There was in this period also the matter of Windsor's own role. He had, by late 77, returned from Ireland. His second tour there had ended in political friction and financial recrimination, and he had come back to England to defend his own account before the Exchequer. He was now available, in a way he had not been earlier, to stand publicly beside Alice as her husband. Whether the marriage was publicly acknowledged at this point, some scholars would date its formal announcement to precisely this juncture, or whether it had been quietly known for some time. He took up the role of her lawful protector. He appeared in the courts on her behalf. He sued and defended in his own name for properties that had been settled to their joint benefit. He signed and sealed instruments that could not, by the law's presumptions, be signed and sealed by a married woman on her own. The chroniclers, when they discovered the marriage, treated it as a further scandal. Walsingham, in particular, was outraged that she should have been married throughout the seasons of her attendance on the aged sovereign, and read the discovery as evidence of her essential duplicity. Modern historians read it differently, as we have seen, as a piece of prudent planning that would prove its worth precisely in the crisis of 77 and after. Without Windsor, she would have been very much more exposed than she was. With him, she had a lawful instrument through which she could act, contest, delay, and on many points prevail. The immediate loss of property was, nevertheless, considerable. A significant portion of the manors the Crown had granted her outright were revoked. A significant portion of the properties she had acquired by purchase, if the acquisitions could be shown to have involved improprieties, were seized or subjected to further courtroom proceedings. Her personal movable goods, jewels, plate, wardrobe, were in principle forfeit, though how much was actually recovered by the throne is unclear. She was at some points, during 78 and 79, formally confined to a manner of assignment, prevented from moving freely, though again the enforcement of this seems to have been intermittent. What she retained, throughout, was the essential core of what she had built. She held the parcels lodged through trustees, whose ownership by her was arguable at best. She preserved her lawful competence, once her husband stood beside her, to sue and defend. She kept a network of allies attorneys, forfeys, minor gentry, whose interests were bound up with her survival, and whose services she continued to have. She commanded a considerable body of hidden or informal resources, cash, plate, credits, obligations, that could be quietly deployed for courtroom costs and for the daily sustenance of her private rooms. and she retained the crucial personal capacity that had brought her to her original position: intelligence, patience, and a great tolerance for the slow work of juridical contest. The next years of her life would be spent in that slow work. The marriage of Alice Perez and William de Windsor, whatever its exact date, was in one respect notable throughout its duration. For most of it, the two lived apart. His work took him for prolonged spells to Ireland, first in the years 69 to 72 as lieutenant of the sovereign in that realm, and then again, more consequentially, from 73 to 76 in the same office. Alice remained on this side of the Irish Sea, managing her Anglo affairs, occasionally travelling to see him, occasionally receiving him when the Crown's business permitted his return. The pattern was not unusual for aristocratic unions of a certain kind. What was unusual in the Windsor-Perez case was the scale of the wife's independent activities during her husband's absences. To understand William's Irish years is to understand something about the peculiar difficulties of English rule in Ireland in the 14th century. English royal authority there rested on a fragile network of settlements: the Pale, a fortified region around Dublin, a number of walled towns along the coast, scattered inland lordships held by families of Anglo-Norman descent, whose loyalty to the Crown was often nominal at best. Beyond the Pale, the Gaelic Irish lords ruled their own territories, sometimes in alliance with the Crown, sometimes at war with it, always with their own agendas. The office of Lieutenant of Ireland required the holder to defend English possessions, collect what revenue could be extracted from a poor and unwilling colony, maintain some semblance of law, and prevent any single Gaelic prince or Anglo-Irish magnate from becoming too powerful. It was expensive, thankless, and career-threatening work. He took it on because he was competent and available, and because the office carried, at least in principle, considerable powers and considerable emoluments. In practice, the emoluments were less than the expenses. The lieutenant was expected to raise a sizable part of the money he needed from Irish revenues. Those revenues were consistently insufficient, and the office holder, in the usual course of events, ran up debts to the Crown and to private lenders that were charged, in due course, to his own personal account. Windsor was not a wealthy man to begin with, and his tenure of the office consumed his own resources rapidly. His first tenure, 69 to 72, was one of continuous financial embarrassment. He was pressed by his own subordinates for pay. He was pressed by the Exchequer for accounts. He complained to Edward III in a series of surviving letters of the impossibility of the assignment. He was recalled at the end of the first tenure without special disgrace, but without special satisfaction either. His second, from 73 to 76, was worse. He faced a resurgence of Gaelic power under a new generation of chieftains. He faced increasing hostility from the Anglo-Irish nobility, who resented the impositions of an outsider. He faced continuing pressure from London for revenues he could not produce. When he was recalled in 76, in the aftermath of the Good Parliament, he came home to face an inquiry into his conduct in the post. Throughout these seasons, Alice remained in the shires and remained active. The property transactions she was pursuing did not slow. The suits did not pause. The strategic acquisitions continued. She travelled between her manors. She attended to her London affairs. She moved to and from court in the seasons before the Good Parliament, as her convenience and the sovereign's needs dictated. She was in one sense a wife with an absent spouse, in another sense an independent operator whose spouse's distance gave her a scope she would not have had if he had been continuously present. Whether the two of them saw one another often is not clear. He was on this side of the Irish Sea. For spells in 72 and 73 between his two tenures. He was here again in the last months of 76 and through 77. There is some suggestion in the records that Alice visited him in Ireland at least once, though the visit is not securely dated. In the usual way of these things, the tie would have been sustained by correspondence letters carried by the network of royal messengers, brief and businesslike on the surface, more personal in what they arranged and provided for. Some of these letters survive. Most do not. What is interesting is the way the marriage worked, at the practical level, as a lawful partnership. Her husband was, throughout, the ostensible holder of many properties that were in fact hers. When she needed to sue or defend, she often did so through him. When property had to be conveyed, he was frequently the conveyor. This was in part customary practice. Wives' actions almost always ran through their husbands. But in her case, the pattern was more elaborate than usual, because her portfolio of interests was larger and more complex than that of most wives. The pattern also reveals considerable trust between them. He, in his role as her husband, could have exploited his standing for his own benefit. He does not appear to have done so. He acted consistently as her ally rather than her rival. There was, in the seasons 77 to 80, a further set of proceedings against Windsor himself, arising from his conduct as Lieutenant of Ireland. He was accused of financial irregularities, of oppression of the Irish, of misuse of his post. He defended himself vigorously in the Exchequer. He produced accounts, explanations, witnesses. He was, in the end, largely cleared. Though the shadow of the accusations remained on his record, the inquiry occupied him through the very time in which Alice was under her own attack in Parliament, and the two of them, in effect, fought parallel actions on adjacent tracks. The Irish connection had one further consequence for her affairs. His tenure as lieutenant had left him with a network of Irish and Anglo-Irish acquaintances, some of whom found their way to this side of the sea in the following seasons and appear, in various minor capacities, in Alice's dealings. She was not, as some later fictions would suggest, herself involved in Irish matters, but her spouse's connections there gave her a slightly wider frame of contacts than she would otherwise have had. And in a period of political stress, those contacts were, at moments, useful. The Irish spells, then, were a phase in which the arrangement functioned as a distributed partnership, the two spouses in different jurisdictions, each pursuing their own affairs, each ultimately serving what they had come to see as their joint interest. It was a partnership that would continue, in one form or another, until his death in the middle 80s, and it was a partnership that gave Alice, at every critical juncture of her contest, a male name to sign the papers, a male body to appear in the courts, a male voice to answer questions to which a female voice would not have been credited between the sitting of October 77 and the closing seasons of the decade. Alice conducted what modern pleaders would call a comprehensive campaign of appellate and collateral litigation against the sentence passed upon her. The campaign was not a single lawsuit, but a many-headed collection of actions, petitions to the council, requests for pardons, defensive actions in the courts of common law, suits in the equitable jurisdiction of chancery, appearances by her spouse on her behalf. Quiet negotiations through intermediaries. It ran for years. It absorbed enormous quantities of her time, her money, and her personal energy, and it produced, incrementally, results that would have been considered impossible when the sentence was first passed. The first line of attack was procedural. The good Parliament's proceedings against her, and the sitting of 77's reaffirmation of them, had been carried out under a novel process. The impeachment procedure that had, in strict terms, no long-standing basis in Anglo law. It was open to argument, and her counsel took issue vigorously. That the sentence was procedurally defective on a variety of grounds, that the counts had been vague, that the witnesses had not been properly heard, that the individual offences had not been proved to the required standard, that the punishment had been disproportionate to the offences, that the ordinance requiring her removal from court was in itself of doubtful force. These arguments would not, in a modern courtroom, have all held. Some of them were technicalities, of the sort that skilled pleaders advanced to test the ground, but in the fluid environment of the late 1400s, technicalities had real weight, and each of them was capable of extracting some concession, some delay, some incremental restoration. A second line of attack was petitionary. She, through her husband and through her network of counsel, submitted petitions to the throne and to the council, asking for relief from the sentence on grounds of hardship, of the impossibility of enforcement, of the injustice of particular applications. The petitions were not always granted, but they were not always denied either. In the matter of certain named parcels, the council determined that the forfeiture had extended too far, and that specific manors should be restored to her or to Windsor. In the matter of the named debts, the council determined that the accounting had been faulty and that the sums should be reduced. As to several of the awards, the council determined that they had been properly made and should stand. A third line was practical. Alice and her council worked to make the sentence expensive and inconvenient to enforce. Every escheator who came to survey a forfeited manor was met by opposing claims from feoffees, from tenants, from parties alleging prior interests. Every seizure was met by an action for wrongful taking. Every rent that was to be diverted to the Crown was contested by a tenant who claimed to have already paid it, or to owe it under a different tenure, or to be entitled to withhold it for some counterclaim. The apparatus of the Crown was not equipped to prosecute such a diffuse and multi-fronted defensive campaign efficiently. Cases dragged, officers gave up, enforcement lagged. A fourth line, and perhaps the most important in the long run, was political. Her enemies of 76 and 77 were not a permanent coalition. The alliance of the Commons, the Black Prince's party, the older magnates opposed to Gaunt, and various clerical interests had come together for specific purposes and would, once those purposes were achieved or defeated, dissolve. Within a few years, the political landscape of Richard II's minority government had shifted considerably. Gaunt's standing had strengthened. Others of her former enemies had died, or fallen from favour, or lost interest. New men had risen who had no personal quarrel with her. As the political weather changed, so did the receptivity of the government to her petitions of relief, and the pace of restoration quickened. By the middle of the 80s, she had recovered a large portion of what she had lost. Not all, not the courtly standing, which was gone forever, not the direct favour from the throne, which had died with the aged sovereign, but a very large proportion of the manors, rents, and rights that had been notionally forfeited in 77 were by 85 restored to her possession or that of her spouse. The restorations were not usually announced with any fanfare. They took the form of quiet judgments, of pardons enrolled in the patent rolls, of grants that reversed earlier grants. The cumulative effect, however, was that she, at the end of the process, still retained a portfolio of very considerable value. The techniques she deployed deserve close attention because they illustrate what was possible for a determined and well-advised litigant in the late medieval Anglo system. She drew upon the delay inherent in that system. Matters could take years to bring to judgment, and rights could be preserved by keeping them in issue. She exploited the multiplicity of jurisdictions. Actions could be brought in the common law courts, in chancery, in the courts of the counties, in the courts of the church, in the council, and could be moved from one to another when a favourable judge was available. She leaned on the doctrine of fiefment. Her interests in lands taken through trustees were difficult to attack directly and required indirect and lengthy proceedings. She relied on the complicity of local officials, some of whom were bribed or persuaded, others of whom were simply reluctant to disturb established possession. And she let the passage of time do its work, which softened memories and softened animosities. The picture that emerges is of a courtroom operator of considerable skill. Alice was not, so far as we know, herself trained. The profession was closed to her sex, but she had learned the law's uses through long practical experience, and she employed pleaders who were among the best of their generation. William Grey, William Wykeham, and other lesser-known figures appear in her documents as advisors. She paid them well. She listened to their advice. She made shrewd tactical choices about which battles to fight and which to concede. The result was a recovery that would have been, in the darkest days of 77, difficult to predict. By the end of the decade, she was, in effect, rehabilitated as a landholder, if not as a courtier. The next chapters of her existence would be spent in the arena, so recovered. The England in which Alice spent the second half of her existence was, in ways obvious and subtle, a different country from the one in which she had risen. Richard II had come to the throne in 77 as a boy of 10. By the middle 80s, he was a young man of 18, feeling his way into an independent kingship. By the late 80s, his relationship with his greater nobility was drifting into the crisis that would produce the merciless sitting of 88, the appellant's brief regime, and eventually the confrontations that would end his reign in 99. Through all of these convulsions, Alice was, at most, a marginal figure. The palace culture that had made her possible no longer existed. The sovereign who had loved her was dead. She was a private principal, living on her estates, and her connections to the highest courtly circles had been reduced to the level of casual acquaintance among the gentry of the counties in which her lands lay. This was, in one respect, a reduction. She had once been able, by a whispered word to the aging monarch, to alter judgments in the King's Bench and redirect grants of manors. She could not do this now. The apparatus of favour on which her earlier standing rested had been dismantled. The chroniclers, in their brief mentions of her in the 80s and after, no longer treated her as a public figure of consequence. They treated her as an inconvenient survival, an embarrassing reminder of a past scandal, and eventually, once she had become old and quiet, they largely ignored her. But the reduction was not, in every respect, unwelcome. Alice had been, throughout the seasons of her greatest public prominence, under continuous pressure. She had been publicly named, she had been publicly attacked. She had been the object of chronicle denunciation and of parliamentary process. The reduction of her public visibility freed her, in a way, from those pressures. She could live where she chose. She could manage what she owned. She could see her children, arrange their weddings, plan her succession, and pursue the quiet occupations of a widow of ample means, without the constant necessity of defending herself against her enemies. Richard's palace, for its part, would not have welcomed her had she wished to return, which she does not appear to have wished. The young monarch had, as young rulers often do, his own set of favourites, his own faction, his own preoccupations. His establishment was staffed by his own choices. Robert de Vere, Michael de la Pole, others of the group whose rise would provoke the confrontations with the appellants. His entourage's character was different, more attentive to art and to elegance than his grandfather's, more given to intellectual pursuits, more removed from the chivalric militarism of the earlier reign. It was not a place to which she, in her 40s and 50s, could plausibly have contributed anything the young king would have wanted. She would have been, at best, an oddity. She was, moreover, still under the residual disabilities of her sentence. Even after the sizable campaign of recovery, certain restrictions remained. She was, in some formal way, still under a ban from approaching the sovereign. She was still under the shadow of the perjury judgment of 77. Her reputation was still that of one who had been publicly condemned. These disabilities did not entirely prevent her from participating in the public affairs of the counties in which she owned property, but they did place limits. She did not, for example, take local offices in the accustomed way of others of her means. She did not appear in the ceremonial affairs of the church at the level her wealth might have suggested. She was, in social terms, a figure under a cloud. And the cloud persisted. There is a scattered but revealing set of records from the 80s that show her nonetheless active in the daily business of a landed proprietor. She sued tenants who defaulted. She was sued by tenants who claimed her officers had oppressed them. She entered into agreements with neighbouring landowners about boundary disputes, common rights, and the exchange of small parcels. She made settlements upon her children. Her son John de Southeray had, in the aftermath of Edward's death, briefly enjoyed the recognition of his royal descent, but his career thereafter had faltered, and Alice's provisions for him and for his sisters were among the recurring themes of her later property arrangements. She dealt with fiefs who had grown old or died and needed to be replaced. She oversaw, from a distance, the running of manors she rarely visited. The impression is of one living in her middle years, the accustomed existence of a widow or wife of well-off gentry, with the significant caveat that everything she owned had been earned, in one way or another, through a career that no common widow or gentry wife could have had. She was, in her own being, an anomaly. But the daily texture of her existence, once the crisis of the late 70s had subsided, was not much different from that of the other landholding women of her class. There is a further point worth making about the relationship between Alice and the Richard II regime. The young sovereign, in the years when his personal government was taking shape, was engaged in a project of reclaiming the throne's dignity from what he saw as its diminution under the impeachments and constraints of the previous years. He was, in a real way, an heir to the courtly tradition that she had been part of, one that regarded parliamentary interference in the Crown's government as an affront. There is no evidence that Richard took any special interest in her cause, and no evidence that she petitioned him for restoration of the honours she had lost. But there is some suggestion in the archives that she benefited, in indirect ways, from the general slackening of hostility toward those who had been the objects of the earlier Assembly's attacks. Certain of her old associates were rehabilitated. A few of her old enemies were themselves attacked. The public context, in short, was gradually becoming friendlier. The pivotal moment of the public history of the reign, the merciless Assembly of 88, did not, so far as we can tell, involve Alice directly. She was not attacked. She was not named. The appellants had different targets, separate grievances, distinct objectives. She lived through the crisis, as she lived through most upheavals of these years, quietly on her estates, attending to her affairs, and grateful to be unnoticed. By the end of the decade, she was around 50, wealthy, married, mother of children, who were themselves approaching, or in their adulthood, mistress of a sizable network of holdings and interests, and largely invisible to the public affairs of the country. It was a diminished standing by comparison with what she had once occupied, but by comparison with what a defendant condemned by the good Parliament could reasonably have expected to survive to enjoy. It was extraordinary, and it was, in every meaningful way, hers. To understand what Alice Perez achieved as a landowner, it helps to attempt some kind of quantification. Modern historians who have gone through the patent rolls, the close rolls, the Esquitas inquisitions, the surviving deeds and probate records, and the various collateral references in the archives of religious houses and municipal authorities have arrived at estimates that vary in detail but agree in outline. At her peak, in the middle 70s, Alice controlled, directly or through fees, at least 50 manors and probably more. She drew rents from perhaps 100 additional properties. She had interests in 15 counties, with concentrations in Hertfordshire, Essex, Buckinghamshire, Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Nottinghamshire, and the home counties around London. The annual value of the whole was, on the estimates of Ormrod and others, in the order of £1,000, a very sizable income for the period, comparable to the revenues of a middling earl. To place this in context, a knight of comfortable but not wealthy standing might expect an annual income of £40. A prosperous merchant of London might do rather better, perhaps £100 or more. But the reliability of merchant incomes was more variable than the reliability of landed rents. A baron of the middle ranks might have an income between £200 and £500. Only the highest earls and dukes, the Lancasters, the Yorks, the Mortimers, the Bohans, and their peers enjoyed larger incomes than she at her height, and their landed portfolios were the accumulations of many generations of noble kin. She had assembled her own portfolio in something under 15 years of concentrated effort, from a starting point of nothing. The composition of the portfolio was diverse. It included fully worked agricultural manors, kept in the accustomed way, with tenants providing labour services or paying money rents. It included market towns, whose tolls and rents provided regular income. It included forest rights, hunting rights, and rights in inland fisheries. It included urban holdings in London and in some of the larger provincial towns, where rents from commercial tenants could be considerable. It included a scattering of parsonages and advowsons, the rights to nominate priests to particular churches, which were regarded as valuable assets for the fees and patronage they carried. It included, at various points, wardships of underage heirs, the temporary custody of estates, and the persons of orphaned children, which could be lucrative to the guardian while it lasted. The administrative apparatus required to manage such a portfolio was considerable. Each property needed a resident bailiff or reeve to oversee the day-to-day work, to keep the account rolls, to collect the rents and dues, to represent the lady's interests in the local court. Above them, riding officers travelled between the villages on Alice's behalf, verifying accounts, adjudicating disputes, negotiating with local magnates. Above them, receivers took in the money and remitted it to Alice, or to whichever of her fecies was designated for the purpose. Above them, small central staff clerks, attorneys, principal advisors, coordinated the whole. The apparatus had to be paid for, checked, and kept responsive to her directions. There is a real question about how personally involved Alice was in the running of these lands. Some medieval great landowners were deeply engaged in the details of estate management. Others delegated everything to competent stewards and lived on the income. Her own case, so far as the records will support inferences, seems to have been more toward the involved end of the spectrum. She was frequently named in disputes as having personally directed particular actions. Her lawyers refer to her instructions with a frequency that suggests she gave many. She travelled among her estates more often than a purely absent proprietor would have done. She had the reputation, both among her allies and her enemies, of being a shrewd and demanding proprietor who was not easily deceived by her officers. What she was building the portfolio for is an interesting question. Some of it, obviously, was for her own comfort and security. Some was for the provisions she would make to her children, John de Southeray, Joan, Jane. Some was, so far as we can tell, for its own sake. The accumulation of land, as a form of value in itself, a hedge against the political vulnerabilities of her position. She was not, so far as any evidence suggests, an extravagant consumer. She did not build the grand houses that some of her contemporaries built. She did not endow the largest religious foundations. She lived, from what we can tell, in the accepted style of a widow of her means, using the manor houses that came with the properties, dressing appropriately for her rank, feeding a domestic circle of moderate size. The main bulk of her income was reinvested in further land. Compared with those of her sex whose economic activities can be reconstructed, she was in a class of her own. There were, in the 1400s, wealthy widows who ran considerable lands. Blanche of Lancaster's mother, Isabella de Beaumont, for example, various abbesses and prioresses of note, certain relics of the wealthy merchant households. There were, at the other end, widows of considerable but conventional wealth who inherited or married into standings of landed comfort. None of them approached what Alice built. None of them started from a footing remotely as unpromising. None of them combined active acquisition on such a scale with the peculiar political vulnerability that Alice's standing carried. The comparison with her peers throws into relief what was distinctive about her matter. She was not building a lineage domain to descend through her heirs, because her heirs were not, in any received view, a noble kin. She was not building on inherited resources, because she had none to inherit. She was not building through the accustomed channels of dower and jointure that came with wedlock into an established landed lineage, because her marriage with William, whatever its practical uses, did not bring landed fortune into the partnership. She was building, in effect, her own portfolio from her own resources. Resources that, in the age she was born into, no one of her sex was supposed to have. The accumulation was, in that respect, an assertion. It was an assertion of independent economic personhood on a scale that the 14th century order had not clearly anticipated. It was an assertion of the capacity of one female principal, with a network of male advisors and agents, but with her own hand at the centre of the network, to operate as an economic actor of significance in a regime that recognized almost no independent economic actorhood for her sex outside the individual categories of widowhood and the highly circumscribed femme sole. It was an assertion that could only have been made by someone with unusual leverage that came, in her case, from favour at the throne, but that, once made, could be defended and in significant part preserved. When the sentences of 76 and 77 were passed against her, they were, among other things, an attempt to unmake this assertion, to reduce Alice, by legal action, to the standing that the received order thought she should occupy. That the attempt substantially failed is not the least important thing about her career. It suggests that once such an assertion has been made, and once the practical apparatus for defending it has been built, the standard structures of the 14th century law are not necessarily equipped to dismantle it. Alice had built something that outran the categories designed to contain her, and the categories were not able, in the end, to catch up. It is worth pausing over the individual character of some of the holdings she preserved, because the impression of scale in a discussion that proceeds by aggregated figures can become abstract. Consider Wendover, in Buckinghamshire, one of her earlier acquisitions and an estate to which the records return repeatedly. Wendover, in the middle 1400s, was a modest market town at the foot of the Chiltern Escarpment, with a weekly fair, a parish church of some antiquity, several watermills along the little river that runs down from the hills, and a hinterland of arable fields worked in the traditional 2- and 3-field systems. It was not a lordly domain by the standards of an earl or a duke, but it was a competent, productive rural community whose annual revenues in rents, tolls, mill dues, and demesne farming came to something in the order of £40 or £50. To own Wendover was to have a claim on the daily labour and the annual harvests of several hundred people, and to be responsible, through one's bailiff and reeve, for the daily administration of their village existence. She kept it, in one form or another, over long stretches. She had a stake in the well or ill running of a modest Anglo town, in a way that the abstract accounts, which convert all of this into numbers, tend to conceal, multiply Wendover by 50 or 100, and you begin to see the actual reach of her domain. Each of these places had its own church, its own customary rents, its own tenant families with genealogies stretching back into the 1200 or earlier, its own individual arrangements of common land and private demesne. To be the lady of such a place was not to be a distant creditor collecting numbers. It was to be a definite figure in a definite network of village relationships, however mediated by officials. When her bailiff at one of her Essex properties sat the local court twice a year and heard the modest pleas of debt and trespass and heriot that had accumulated since the last hearing, he did so in her name and by her authority. When a wedding fine was paid by a tenant's daughter's suitor before they could marry, it was paid, in the end, to her account. When a widow of a customary tenant was found dead in her cottage and her tenancy had to be reassigned, it was her officer who decided, subject to the customs of the village, who would take it up. These were the modest and important details of the rural existence over which she presided. The specifically economic character of the portfolio deserves further attention. Not all of her manors were of the same kind. Some were arable estates concentrating on grain production for the London market, the corn-growing lands of the eastern counties, whose surpluses moved down the rivers to feed the capital's growing appetite. Some were pastoral tracts concentrating on wool, particularly on the Chalk Downs and in the Western Midlands, whose fleeces fed the great cloth trade that was one of the century's economic engines. Some were urban lands, kept for rents, in London and in the larger provincial towns. Some were mixed and marginal parcels whose value lay less in any particular product than in a diversified small return from woodland, meadow, market and mill. To manage such a diverse portfolio was to require different competencies in different places, and Alice's administrative apparatus had, over the years of its development, learned to accommodate this diversity. Her clerks kept accounts in the customary form of manorial rolls, a document type whose stability across centuries reflects the essential continuity of the underlying rural economy. But the receivers who consolidated the returns had to think in more portfolio-like terms. And the highest levels of her administration were doing something not far removed from what a modern estate manager would recognise as diversified investment. The assembly that met in the autumn of 77 has been referred to already in the account of her fall as the Parliament that renewed the sentences against her. But it deserves separate examination because in its distinct procedures and its distinct outcomes, it reveals things about the medieval courtly process and about her precise standing within that process that a summary cannot convey. It was a proceeding in which the juridical fictions and public realities of the moment ran in visible collision against one another, and in which the residual power of an unpopular but wealthy defendant to defend herself was on open display. The Parliament had been called for the customary purposes of a new reign, to confirm the young monarch's title, to grant supplies for the government of the realm, to hear the grievances of the wider community. It met at Westminster, in the same immense hall where the assemblies of the previous reign had met, and its personnel included many who had been present at the good Parliament of the earlier season. Peter de la Mare, released from the prison to which Gaunt had committed him after the counter-coup of the previous autumn, was again elected Speaker. The Commons, once more, took the lead in raising the grievances. But there were important differences from the gathering of the previous session. The old king was now dead. The Black Prince was also dead. Gaunt's public weight was greater. The senior magnates, aware that the future of the regime depended on a workable settlement between throne, nobility, and commons, were more willing to compromise than they had been earlier. Among the items of business was the reactivation of the earlier proceedings. The commons formally requested that the previous ordinance be reaffirmed. The lords, sitting as judges, considered the request. What followed was not, in form, a fresh trial, but a resumption of the existing matter. Her defenders, her husband, appearing formally on her behalf, together with a bench of pleaders, whose names appear in the record, took issue with the procedural basis on which the resumption rested, with the presumed continuity between the ordinance of the previous summer and the fresh action, and with what they called the vagueness of the fresh instruments then being framed. The government's case, in outline, was that she had violated the terms of the ordinance by returning to the sovereign's side in the previous October, that she had continued, throughout the last months of the old reign, to exercise improper influence over him, that she had accumulated, in that span, further properties by means that would not stand scrutiny, and that her behaviour had confirmed the earlier accusations of perjury and misconduct. Separate counts named the interference with justice at Westminster, the sale of favours, and the appropriation of goods from the Treasury. The Lords found against her, more or less on all counts. She was, as she had been before, declared perjured. She was, again, declared forfeit of her goods and lands. She was, again, ordered to withdraw from any place where the sovereign might be. But the sentence, this time, included some interesting modifications. It provided for separate exceptions and reservations. Properties settled upon William de Windsor, as her spouse, for example, were expressly protected. It provided for the possibility of appeal to the council in cases of special hardship. It provided a mechanism by which pardons might, in due course, be sought. In short, the sentence was more elaborate and more workable than the earlier instrument, and it created in its own text the openings through which she would eventually secure her partial rehabilitation. The presence of Windsor in the proceedings deserves separate attention. He was, formally, the defendant on his own behalf, because the sentences of the previous year had, in some measure, threatened properties he claimed in his own right, as well as speaking on her behalf. His interventions in the record were competent and vigorous. He challenged the specific counts. He offered accounts of the property transactions. He insisted on the lawful presumption of his marital rights over lands owned by his spouse. He was, in effect, the visible principal on whom the defensive strategy hung, and his presence made a considerable difference to how the proceedings unfolded. The other man whose presence should be noted is Gaunt. He was, in the Parliament of the autumn, present but relatively subdued. He had, in the 12 months since his counter-coup, learned that direct confrontation with the Commons was politically costly. He preferred, in this assembly, to allow the sentences against her to be passed, so long as they were narrowed by the various reservations and exceptions that his council could get included in the drafting. This was, in its way, an act of protection. Gaunt was allowing her to be formally condemned, while ensuring that the practical damage was limited. It was not friendship, it was pragmatism. He had no special affection for her. She had, in his father's last years, been a rival for the sovereign's attention. But he had no special animus toward her either, and he understood that a defendant with her wealth and her lawful standing could not be simply erased by ordinance. The Commons, for their part, expressed a certain frustration at the settlement that emerged. Peter de la Mare and his colleagues had wanted a cleaner and harsher outcome, but they accepted, in the end, the settlement they could get, and they moved on to other business. Her own presence at the proceedings, she was, according to some accounts, brought before it in person to hear the sentence passed, is not securely documented in the surviving records. It is quite possible that she attended, quite possible that she did not. What is clear is that she did not attempt to flee the country or to hide from the proceedings. She stayed within England, defended herself through her counsel, and, once the sentence was passed, began immediately to work on the process of chipping away at it. The proceedings of 77 were, in one sense, her second considerable public defeat. In another sense, it was the beginning of her long strategic recovery. The sentence was severe. It was also, by its own terms, subject to the exceptions and appeals that would, over the following years, allow much of what she had built to be preserved. Alice's story is, in one obvious respect, exceptional. Very few figures of her sex in 14th century England accumulated wealth on her scale, wielded political influence to the degree she did, or provoked the sustained hostility of the chroniclers that she attracted. But her career is also, in a subtler way, exemplary. It illustrates in unusually clear form the juridical and social structures within which the entire sex lived in the era, and the ways in which those structures both enabled and constrained the exercise of female agency. To understand Alice fully, it is worth pausing to consider these structures in themselves. The dominant juridical doctrine that shaped a wife's existence was coverture. The term derives from the notion that she was in law, covered by her husband, that her lawful personality was subsumed into his, that she could not act independently in the courts or in most transactions, that her lands became his to manage while the wedlock endured. Coverture was not a peculiarly Anglo institution. While that qualms of it existed across most of pre-modern Europe, but Anglo common law developed the doctrine with unusual rigour. A wife could not sue in her own name for most causes of action. She could not be sued in her own name. She could not enter into contracts. She could not make a testament of most of her lands. If she committed a felony, she was presumed to have acted under her husband's coercion unless the contrary were proved. The rigour was tempered by a variety of exceptions and workarounds. She could own land, though she could not dispose of it without her husband's consent, and its issues went to him during their wedlock. She could keep personal chattels that had been settled to her separate use. She could act as her husband's agent if he authorized it, and could bind him by her actions in that capacity. She could take lands in trust for her separate use. This was the developing device of the equitable separate estate, though its full elaboration would come later. She could, in London and in some other boroughs, operate as a femme sole in trade, taking the standing of an independent actor for commercial purposes while remaining under coverture in others. But these exceptions confirmed, rather than displaced, the general presumption that a wife was lawfully invisible. Widowhood, by contrast, restored full lawful personality. A widow could sue and be sued in her own name. She could own land outright. She could make a testament. She could enter contracts. She could remarry or refuse to remarry as she chose, principal in Bill de Tobadwa. Her dower, the customary 1/3 of the husband's lands, guaranteed by common law, gave her a base of independent means. Her jointure, the estate settled upon her at the wedding, to keep jointly with her husband and to succeed to on his passing, often provided a further base. Widowhood was, in the calculation of many, the freest and most powerful standing they might attain, and there was some acknowledgement that a wealthy widow was, in effect, a party of solid capacity. Never married women, femme soles, in the technical usage, occupied a more ambiguous place. In principle, they had full, lawful capacity, like widows. In practice, they were rare, because such females of substance were unusual in a system that expected daughters to marry, and never married ones without means were generally in the establishments of their fathers, brothers, or employers, and their independent actions were correspondingly few. What Alice appears to have been, in the seasons before her marriage to William, was a femme sole in this technical usage, a never married holder of holdings in her own right, acting on her own. This is one of the reasons her standing is so unusual. She was not fitting into any of the established categories. There is a further class of exception that deserves mention: the femme sole trader status of London and certain other boroughs. This was a customary rule that permitted a wife to conduct trade in her own name, with her own capital, distinct from her husband's estate. It arose out of the practical necessities of urban commerce. The spouses of merchants often traded alongside their husbands and needed the capacity to bind themselves in trade. And it gave to certain wives a degree of economic personality that the general common law denied. Alice's connection to the London merchant community, if the reconstructions of her origins are correct, may have given her early familiarity with this arena. When we place her against this juridical background, her operations become clearer. She exploited the space created by her unmarried status in the seasons of her greatest acquisition. She drew on the additional room created by the discreet character of her marriage to Windsor, which permitted her to continue acting on many matters as if she were a femme sole. She leaned on the doctrine of feuillement to uses to keep her holdings through trustees, which effectively bypassed some of the difficulties that coverture and similar doctrines created. She retained the professional counsel available to any figure of her wealth. She mobilized the accumulated resources of a network of male allies who were willing to lend their names and their formal appearances to transactions that, in substance, were hers. She was not the only woman of her period to exploit these openings, but she pushed them further than most did. What was unusual about her was not the technique, but the scale, the audacity, and the peculiar exposure of what she built. Alice worked with the sole protection of a favour that was, by definition, going to end when the aging king did. Her career also illustrates something about the relationship between the sexes and the political sphere. 14th century English politics operated, in its formal aspects, in an entirely masculine sphere. Parliament was a body of men, the councils were bodies of men, the courts were staffed by men, the offices of state were kept by men, the military commands were carried by men. Wives, daughters, and mothers had, in this formal sphere, no place except as the objects, occasionally, of manoeuvre and as the private connections of the men who took formal action. Any female figure who acquired real influence had to do so by informal means, by proximity to a powerful man, by control of access, by the informal networks of kin and chamber. This was true of queens as well as of mistresses. It was true of Philippa of Hainaut. It was true of Isabella of France. It was true, in later reigns, of Catherine of Valois and Margaret of Anjou. Alice's situation was, in this respect, less unusual than her critics believed. She was doing what her sex in her structural place did. What was unusual was that she did it very well and did not entirely stop doing it when the man on whom her standing depended was gone. It is worth considering, in this thematic pause, one further element that shaped how women of her period could and could not act in public: the church and the rhetorical framework the church supplied for thinking about feminine character. The clergy of that era, in England as elsewhere, transmitted through their sermons and their manuals of confession an anthropology of the sex that was, in its dominant strains, deeply cautious. They were, in the tradition, inherited from the Church Fathers and reworked by the schoolmen of the 12th and 13th centuries, the daughters of Eve inheritors of a distinct weakness that had been the cause of the fall, and vessels of a distinct danger to the moral integrity of men. This framework did not preclude admiration for particular figures. The same tradition produced the veneration of the Virgin, the celebration of women saints, and a considerable devotional literature that placed such figures at its centre. but it did mean that any who acted publicly, in ways that departed from the accepted domestic sphere, could be read through a lens that was primed for disapproval. She could be assimilated to the Virgin only with difficulty, and to Eve only too easily. The chroniclers, who were mostly clerics, wrote within this framework. When Walsingham described Alice as a woman who had bewitched the aged king through arts that were better not specified, he was drawing on a template centuries old. The template of the temptress whose influence was corrosive precisely because it operated through the familiar and pardonable weaknesses of male desire. The template gave writers a ready shape into which any particular woman could be poured. And it gave readers a ready pattern for understanding what they were being told. The specific facts of Alice's actual conduct did not need to fit the template exactly. The template supplied the interpretive weight. The facts supplied the illustrative detail. There was, at the same time, a countervailing tradition in clerical writing that could support a more sympathetic reading of women in public affairs. This was the tradition of Christian charity, of the recognition that all persons, including daughters of Eve, were made in the image of God, and of the acknowledgement that providence sometimes worked through unlikely instruments. The devotional literature in the vernacular languages, which was expanding rapidly in the 1400s, made increasing use of women's voices and women's experience as vehicles for religious insight. The English mystics of the later era, Walter Hilton, Julian of Norwich, the anonymous author of The Cloud of Unknowing, were writing, in their various ways, within a spiritual atmosphere that gave considerable dignity to interior experience, regardless of the sex of the person experiencing it. This was not a setting that would have easily produced a defense of her cause. The mystics' concerns were quite different from those of the parliamentary chroniclers, but it was one in which a more complex assessment of women's spiritual and moral capacity was possible, and which lay at the edges of the culture, alongside the more traditional condemnations. Neither tradition, however, quite prepared the political community for a woman whose activity was primarily economic and juridical rather than either domestic or devotional. Alice was not a saint. She was not a wife in the received meaning. She was not a widow living quietly on her dower. She was not a merchant spouse trading under the femme sole custom. She was doing something for which the clerical, the juridical, and the popular categories all lacked a comfortable name. When the categories fail, contemporaries reach for the closest available fit, and the closest available fit for a woman near a king, extracting favours, accumulating wealth, was the harlot of the moralizing tradition. She was fitted, in the writings of the chroniclers, into a role that had existed in the literary imagination since the time of the Old Testament kings. And the fitting was easier for the writers precisely because Alice's actual situation was so novel. Modern historians, who have taken up her story, have found themselves obliged to work back through this layering. Behind the chronicle account, there is a real figure doing real things in a real juridical environment. The layer of moralizing invective has to be peeled away, without pretending it is not there, because it shaped how she was seen and remembered, and without letting it dictate the modern reading. Underneath that layer is a second layer of political attack, the specific charges laid against her in Parliament, some of which had substance, and some of which were rhetorical elaborations of grievances that were more properly directed elsewhere. Beneath that layer is a third layer of documentary evidence: the wardrobe accounts, the patent rolls, the deeds, the plea rolls, the palace ordinances, which permits, with patient reading, a reconstruction of what she actually did. What emerges from this reconstruction is a woman for whom the categorical failures of her age were, in some measure, an opportunity. Because the world had no ready-made role for what she was doing, it also had no ready-made mechanism for containing her. The doctrines of coverture did not apply neatly to her, because she was, for much of her active career, unmarried and technically a femme sole. The apparatus of dower did not apply, because there was no husband whose estates were the source of her wealth. The rules of inheritance did not apply, because she was building rather than inheriting. Each of these gaps in the standard structures was for Alice a small door through which she could pass. It required unusual competence to see the doors and unusual courage to walk through them. But the doors were there. They were open, partly because the medieval world had, in the aftermath of the plague and in the fluidity of the mid-century, not yet closed them, and partly because the categories had never been comprehensive enough to close every possibility. There is a broader point about the sex Alice's story tends to reinforce. The commonly received impression that 14th century women were uniformly excluded from public affairs is, when examined closely, less a description of the actual society than an artifact of the sources historians have most commonly used. The chronicles, the parliamentary rolls, the political correspondence. These are records of a masculine political culture that recorded the presence of that sex only when it became inconvenient. But when scholars have looked at the plea rolls, the deed collections, the borough archives, the wardrobe accounts, the domestic books, they have found her present in numbers and in activities that the chronicles do not lead one to expect. The wives of merchants conducted trade, gentry wives managed properties during their husbands' absences. Peasant wives appeared in the local courts as debtors, creditors, litigants. The church-going classes organised charities and pilgrimages through their women members. The country of the 1400s was, in its actual operations, more populated by such figures than the traditional narrative had permitted us to see. Her story is exceptional in scale, but not in kind. She was doing, at an unprecedented level of ambition and success, what many of her sex were doing at more modest levels. She had access to unusual resources, the initial leverage of favour from the throne, and the intellectual and administrative gifts that let her turn that leverage into a durable structure. But the field on which she operated was not entirely alien to women's activity. It was one on which they were present, and had been present, and would continue to be present, in ways that the writers of chronicles seldom noticed. What Alice did was to occupy that field at a scale that could not be ignored. There is one final observation, which the thematic chapter is the right place to make. The relationship between Alice's story and the story of the Shire's law in the late 1400s is closer than a first reading might suggest. The doctrines she exploited, the Fofment to uses, the equitable separate estate, the flexibility of chancery jurisdiction were in her day still in early stages of development. They would, over the following century, become the mechanisms by which many parties of either sex would evade the rigidities of the older common law. The equity jurisdiction of the Chancellor would grow into a full second body of Anglo law, standing beside the common law, and, in many suits, providing remedies that the older courts could not. Married female estates in equity would, by the Tudor and Stuart eras, become a routine feature of gentry and noble settlements, giving considerable numbers of them a form of financial independence that the strict common law would have denied. Her use of these devices, in her own defence, was an early and unusually visible instance of the sort of manoeuvring that would become the standard practice of many later parties. She was not, we should be careful to say, an innovator in a technical way. The devices she used were being developed by lawyers and judges, not by their clients. But she was a client of extraordinary sophistication who used what her lawyers were developing, and her cause became one of the standing examples of what such devices could accomplish. In this modest way, her story is part of the story of Anglo jurisprudence, as much as it is part of the history of one unusual figure. William de Windsor died in the autumn of 84. The exact date of his passing, like so many exact dates in her story, is not securely fixed, but the surviving records place it in September. He had been ill for some time. The details of the illness are not preserved. He was in his late 50s, perhaps early 60s. His own date of birth is not certain. And he died at one of the manors that had come to the marriage through his own kinlands in Westmoreland, in the far north, rather than at any of the more prominent properties that came through her. He was buried, in the customary way of a knight of his rank, in a local church, without special ceremony. His passing changed her status in ways that were, from her point of view, largely favourable. During the marriage, coverture had placed her in the anomalous standing of being a wife whose spouse, though useful as a lawful instrument, could not, in the customary presumption of the law, be excluded from the ownership of everything she owned. Some of what she had built had, from a strict view, become his to control during the marriage. Some of what came to her through the marriage, through settlements at its origin, through purchases made during it, was jointly retained. It was a complicated portfolio, and the exact division of interest within it would have taxed even a skilled probate pleader. Now, with his passing, the standing simplified. As his widow, she took her dower, 1/3 of the manors he had owned in his own right at his end, for her own use. She took her jointure, the properties settled to her at the wedding, to be retained jointly during it, and to descend to her on his end. She resumed full lawful control over any parcels that had been hers before the marriage and that had been formally settled in a way that preserved her equitable interest. She was, in short, in a stronger footing than she had been at any time since her fall in 77. There is a scattering of records from the immediate aftermath of his death that show her acting decisively on the new position. She confirmed faithments. She sued for the recovery of certain rents that had been detained by his Westmoreland officers. She entered into agreements with the executors of his will regarding the disposal of chattels. She provided for the maintenance of certain retainers who had served him and who would otherwise have been left without support. She was, in these documents, a widow of substance conducting the routine business of a widow of substance, but with an unusually complex portfolio and an unusually well-developed administrative apparatus. Widowhood was, as we shall consider more fully when the story turns toward the thematic, the freest station one of her sex could occupy. In her own instance, she chose not to remarry. This was not surprising. She was, by 84, in her middle 40s. She had offspring who were adults, or nearly so. She had a large and complex estate. Marrying again would have introduced fresh complications into her standing, without conferring any obvious benefit that was not already available to her through her own agency. The remaining seasons of the 80s show her using widowhood well. The recoveries begun in the years after 77 continued, and in some instances accelerated. She was able to bring actions in her own name that had previously required her husband's participation, and she was able to pursue them without the delays that his absence in the north or the illness of his later years had caused. The pleaders she employed continued to serve her, and their names appear in a steady stream of documents through the middle of the decade: the pursuit of a rent here, the confirmation of a title there, the settlement of a dispute somewhere else. There is also, in these seasons, a discernible turning toward the affairs of her offspring. John de Southeray, her son by Edward III, had by this point ceased to be a figure of much political prominence. His brief moment of visibility at the coronation of Richard II had not been followed by any significant career. He had not gained sizable estates from his father's legacy in the way that legitimate sons might have expected to do. His role in the Shire was, at best, that of a minor gentleman whose royal parentage was acknowledged but not particularly exploited. Alice provided for him from her own resources, and the records show her making settlements and providing for his maintenance in various modest ways. Her daughters, Joan and Jane, were by the 80s in adulthood. Joan, married to Robert Skerne, was raising her own children. Jane, or Jane, appears more faintly in the records, but seems to have had a comparable career. Alice provided for both of them in the customary way of a mother of ample means. Settlements at their weddings, provisions for grandchildren, occasional gifts of property or money as circumstances required. Her kin, in effect, was becoming her chief social and juridical concern in the seasons after his passing. In a way it had not been earlier, when the constant pressures of political and courtroom defence had consumed her attention. There is one further point about her widowhood that deserves emphasis. She was, in her standing, unusual not because she was a widow of wealth. There were many such, but because the fortune she had was entirely her own creation. Most wealthy widows of the era were widows of powerful men whose estates they had inherited or held for life. Alice was the widow of a middling knight. Her holdings were her own accumulation. When she made settlements of her estates on her offspring, she was not distributing inherited property according to customary norms. She was distributing the fruits of her own long and difficult career, and the distribution reflected her own considered choices about who should receive what. The picture we have of Alice in the mid-80s, then, is of one in her middle years, of ample and independent means, in full lawful control of her own affairs, with a set of adult offspring whose futures were her chief concern, engaged in the quiet management of a complex estate. It was, by the standards of the age, an enviable standing. It was also, by the standards of her own earlier existence, a period of unusual peace. The remaining 15 seasons or so of Alice's story, from the middle 80s to about 1400, are the least documented of her career. The reason is straightforward. She was no longer of political interest, and the leading annals that had followed her earlier career either ceased to mention her or mentioned her only in passing, in the context of retrospective references to the old scandals. Walsingham grew more preoccupied with the crises of Richard II's rule, and later with the deposition and its aftermath. The Anonymal Chronicle had by this point faded from active continuation. The remaining monastic histories that survived the Westminster record, various municipal annals, a scattering of northern compilations, treated her, when they treated her at all, as a survival from an earlier age whose current activities were of no interest. But the administrative documentation continued. Land transactions did not cease to be enrolled merely because the principal transacting them was no longer politically prominent. The patent enrolments, the close enrolments, the chancery documents, the exchequer accounts, all of these continued to preserve, at their accustomed level of detail, the dealings in which she was involved. And what these documents show is a continuous, if reduced, level of activity. Confirmations, minor lawsuits, settlements on her offspring, arrangements with her faefies, occasional appearances in disputes with neighbouring landowners. The pattern of activity in these seasons is one of consolidation rather than expansion. Alice was no longer acquiring new lands on the scale of the 70s. She was, instead, managing what she had, preserving titles, ensuring that her fiefdoms were properly maintained, and preparing her portfolio for what would come after her. There is, in the archive, a sense of an aging principal, aware that she was moving toward the end of her active existence and organising her affairs accordingly. The individual transactions from this period are numerous but individually minor. There is an enrolment of a suit in 86 against a defaulting tenant on a Buckinghamshire manor. There is one of a compromise in 88 with a neighbouring landowner over a disputed boundary. There is one of a settlement in 89 upon Joan Skerne, her daughter, of a distinct property. There is one of a purchase in 91 of certain rents in Hertfordshire, one of the few evidences of new acquisition in these seasons, and probably intended for a specific settlement. There is one of council appointed in 93 to represent her in an ongoing dispute with the executors of a former tenant, and so on. An accumulation of modest transactions that, taken together, give the picture of an aging principal still active, but no longer expanding. Her physical residences in these seasons appear to have shifted somewhat. She spent less time on the more distant manors and more on those in the home counties, particularly in Essex and Hertfordshire. This was probably in part a function of age. Travel was tiring for one in her 50s and 60s, in an era where the fastest available transport was a horse, and in part a function of the practical convenience of being near London and the courts, where much of the residual business had to be conducted. There is a suggestion, in the surviving references, that she maintained a house in London for occasional use. Though the details are not preserved, her connections to her offspring continued and appear to have been close. Joan Skerne, in particular, seems to have been in regular contact with her mother, both because of the accustomed bonds of kin and because Joan's own affairs, her marriage to Robert Skerne, her raising of children, her management of the domestic circle in Kingston upon Thames, intersected with her mother's interests in various ways. There are records of joint appearances in actions, of shared fofments, of settlements passing back and forth between mother and daughter. The relationship, from what one can reconstruct, was that of an ordinary, if unusually well-resourced mother and adult daughter, with the mother in the senior standing, but the daughter treated as a competent adult with her own affairs. John de Southeray's later career is more obscure. Some scholars have suggested that he died young, perhaps in the middle 80s, though the evidence is not decisive. Others have argued that he lived into the 90s but ceased to be a figure of public interest. Whichever is the case, he does not appear frequently in the surviving documents of Alice's later years, and it seems that his mother's provisions for him were, in the end, more modest in consequence than her provisions for her daughters. This was in the era. A slight anomaly sons were usually the primary object of maternal financial planning, but it fits the general pattern of her practical rather than sentimental approach to kin arrangements. She provided for the offspring who were there to be provided for, in the ways that were most useful. The convulsions of Richard's rule in these seasons passed through the background of Alice's later existence, without leaving direct marks in the records of her affairs. What is striking is not that she was uninvolved. A private landowner in her 60s would scarcely be expected to intervene, but that even the shadows are absent. No summons to court, no request for her testimony, no letter of instruction from the appellants. No writ from Richard's private government reaches her doorstep in any document that survives. She was not aligned with any faction. She was not solicited by any faction. She was, at most, a spectator, whose observations, if she made them at her hearth to Joan or to a visiting attorney, went unrecorded and are lost. The one exception, perhaps, is the deposition of 99. Bolingbroke, who came to the throne as Henry IV, was the son of John of Gaunt, and Gaunt's death earlier that year had precipitated the crisis. She, who had known Gaunt in the years of Edward III's court and had been by turns his rival and his tacit ally, would have had views on the succession. What those views were is not recorded. She did not petition the new regime. She did not appear at the coronation of Henry IV. She did not, so far as any evidence suggests, take any political position. She simply continued, in her final season, to manage her affairs as she had managed them for 2 decades. There is, in the very last of the surviving references to her, a settlement of certain properties upon her daughter Joan. dated late in 99 or early 1400. It is a routine document in the standard form of such settlements, and it makes no pretense to any special significance. But it is, so far as we can now tell, the last confirmed act of Alice Perez, and it fits the pattern that the previous decade had established. The quiet transmission of what she had built to the next generation, without fanfare, without ceremony, in the accustomed channels of the accepted law. Alice died in or about 1400 or 1401. The precise date is not known. No testament of hers survives. No burial certificate has been securely identified. No chronicle notice of her passing was recorded by any of the writers of the era. She simply, at some point in the first season or two of the 1500s, ceased to appear in the administrative documents, and the presumption of her passing has been made from the pattern of that cessation. There is something appropriate to her existence in the manner of its ending. Alice had, throughout her career, been a figure who worked at the edges of documentation, visible when the routine business required paperwork, invisible when it did not. She had been, in the seasons of her greatest prominence, the object of chronicle notice. In the seasons of her long decline she had faded from the chronicles and lived on only in the administrative traces. Now, in her passing, she completed that fading. The administrative traces themselves stopped. The figure who had accumulated more property than any other non-noble of her sex in her generation exited the historical record with no more ceremony than a rent-paying tenant in a distant manor. The failure of a testament to survive is worth pausing on. Alice must have made one. Someone of her wealth and her known planning nature would not have died intestate. The testament would have provided for the disposition of her personal chattels, the confirmation of settlements on her offspring, the making of modest legacies to servants and dependents, the arrangements for her burial, and for the prayers to be said for her soul. Testaments were, in the Anglo-lawful system, drawn up in a fairly standard form and enrolled either in the archdeacon's or bishop's court that had jurisdiction, or, for larger estates, in the prerogative court of Canterbury. That no testament of hers has been found in any of these archives is remarkable but not incomprehensible. Documents of the era were routinely lost through fires, through the standard attrition of monastic archives, through the deliberate destruction of documents at various points over the following hundreds. Its disappearance is one instance of a general problem. But it means that we do not, for her, have the document that would typically be the fullest and most personal account of one's last wishes. The burial is a similar difficulty. She would have been buried somewhere. The manor of Upminster in Essex has traditionally been associated with her final years and with the possibility of her interment, and some later antiquarian sources named a particular church there as her resting place. But the association is not securely documented, and no tomb monument bearing her name has survived. The likelihood is that she was buried, in the customary way, in the parish church of the manor where she died, without a monument of a kind that would have preserved her memory beyond a generation. The estates at her passing went largely to her offspring in accordance with the settlements she had made in her later seasons. Joan and Jane and their heirs took the main body of what had been hers. John de Southeray, if he was still living, took his portion. If he had died before his mother, his provisions passed to the arrangements she had substituted. The estate was, from a distance, dispersed into a number of gentry lineages whose members would over the following generations rise or fall on their own trajectories. Some of the individual properties can still be traced in the records of the 1500s. Some vanished into the routine shuffling of gentry portfolios. The disappearance of Alice from the historical record was, in the immediate aftermath of her passing, more or less complete. She had no widowed husband to preserve her memory. She had no chantry foundation named for her. She had no monastic house that would say masses for her soul in perpetuity. She had not, so far as we know, made the customary foundations that wealthy people of her era made for the perpetual remembrance of their names. The public had noticed her when she was alive because she had been politically inconvenient. When she was no longer politically inconvenient, the public stopped noticing her. There is something worth reflecting on in the speed and completeness of the disappearance. A figure who at her peak had been one of the wealthiest non-noble presences in England, who had been the subject of chronicle denunciation and parliamentary process, who had been the personal companion of one of the mightiest sovereigns of the era, vanishes within a 12-month of her passing into effective silence. Her name is remembered because Walsingham denounced her. Had he not denounced her, she might have been remembered even more faintly. This is not a comfortable observation. It suggests that the historical visibility of female figures of the 1400s, even wealthy and consequential ones, was contingent on their being useful to male chroniclers for the purposes of moral instruction or political attack. Once they were no longer useful, they were forgotten. The contrast with her documented existence is the more striking. While alive, she had been continuously visible in the wardrobe accounts, in the patent enrolments, in the parliamentary registers, in the chronicles, in the correspondence of the mighty, in the juridical actions of the courts. She had generated more documentation, taken as a body, than most crown officers of her era. And then, at her passing, the documentation ceased, and the silence closed over her. Within months, it would be for the later chroniclers, and for the historians of the 16, 17, and 1800s, to rediscover her, to construct portraits of her from the surviving materials, and to shape those portraits in the moral and political frameworks of their own time. In the process, the actual individual who had lived would be, to some considerable degree, replaced by a figure who served the purposes of successive generations of writers. The next chapter of her posthumous existence, on that reckoning, was the shaping of her reputation. Her reputation, as it came down through the succeeding centuries, was formed not by any independent examination of her life, but by the transmission and elaboration of the picture that Thomas Walsingham had painted. Walsingham's chronicle became, in the 1500s, one of the most widely copied and quoted of the Anglo-monastic histories. His portraits of Wycliffe, of Gaunt, of the woman herself, of the peasants' revolt of 81, became, for later writers, the standard versions of the events he had described. Copies of his work circulated in manuscript through the later Tudor generations. It was one of the sources drawn upon by the compilers of the sizable printed chronicles of the early 1600s. It fed, directly and indirectly, into the historiography that would shape the popular memory of the medieval era for many generations. The individual image that Walsingham had constructed, the ambitious concubine, the corrupter of an aged monarch, the pilferer of the crown jewels at the deathbed, was preserved and indeed amplified in the retellings. Ranulph Higden, in his Polychronicon, had already offered a similar version. John Stowe, writing in the late Tudor era, drew upon both. Raphael Holinshed, whose sizable chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland of that century would provide the raw material for Shakespeare and for so many additional later writers, gave the Walsingham version its most influential retelling. She appeared, in these accounts, as a moral emblem, the type of the low-born concubine whose sinister influence corrupts a mighty man in his declining years. She was not, in this literary treatment, an individual so much as a warning. The warning had a distinct political usefulness. In the rhetoric of Tudor England, the figure of the wicked crown favourite was much invoked, both as a way of denouncing current favourites and as a way of praising the theoretical virtues of a well-ordered court. The mistress fitted this rhetorical need conveniently. She was safely distant in time. She had been formally condemned by Parliament. She had been thoroughly denounced by chroniclers. She could be cited, without much risk, as an example of the sort of figure whom good government should exclude. The individual details of her actual doings, the shrewd property management, the legal skill, the survival strategy, were of no interest to writers with this rhetorical purpose, and were quietly ignored. There was a further use to which her tale could be put in the Tudor and Stuart eras. The rise of Protestant historical writing, with its interest in the corruption of the pre-Reformation Church and the moral failures of the pre-Reformation monarchy, found in the same material a piece of evidence for the general degeneracy of the last years of Edward III's reign. The monarch had been, in these accounts, betrayed by Rome-favouring bishops and by unworthy favourites. She was one of the favourites, and her supposed role in extracting crown favours for her cronies fitted the general picture of a corrupt late 1400s court. She became, in Protestant historiography, a minor character in the larger arc of pre-Reformation Anglo decline. The 1800s largely preserved the traditional portrait. David Hume, in his History of England, that treated her in a manner that combined the older moralism with a somewhat cooler Enlightenment tone. He found her interesting as a psychological study, and he was inclined to accept the substance of the older accusations while treating them as evidence of the general susceptibility of aged monarchs to sirens rather than as evidence of any distinct villainy on her part. Several 18th century writers followed similar patterns. The overall picture, through the era, was that the mistress had been a bad woman who had corrupted an old monarch, and that the Parliament of 76 had done well to attack her. It was the 19th century that began, in a limited way, to reconsider. The great expansion of scholarly editions of the medieval sources, beginning with the Rolls series in the middle 19th century, made available to historians the primary materials on which any serious reassessment would have to depend. The patent enrolments, the close enrolments, the parliamentary records, the chronicle texts themselves, all became available in printed editions with scholarly apparatus. Historians could, for the first time, check the older claims against the administrative record, and the check often did not go well for the monastic writers. The first major reassessment came in the early 20th century, in the work of scholars who began to notice that the administrative papers showed a figure who did not much resemble the one drawn by the chroniclers. In those papers she was an active property investor, a skilled litigant, a survivor of formidable attacks. She was not, in the archival source, an individual engaged in the wholesale corruption of justice or in the flagrant looting of the crown. The most egregious of the older claims, the interference with judges, the removal of the rings, were shown to be either uncorroborated or contradicted by additional evidence. The reassessment did not entirely rehabilitate her. She remained, in these earlier 20th century treatments, a subject of dubious morality and questionable methods. But it began to displace the caricature with a more complicated picture. The full reassessment came in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and it was most substantially the work of W.M. Ormrod, whose careful reconstruction of her origins, career, and property dealings, published in a series of articles and in his major biography of Edward III, has become the standard scholarly account. Ormrod's Mistress is a skilled operator in a hostile juridical and courtly environment, whose accumulation of property, though morally questionable, in the same way that any accumulation of place rents in her period was morally questionable, was neither extraordinary in its methods nor uniquely corrupt in its origins. Her attacks by Parliament are seen as reflecting the anxieties of the moment, rather than as being justified by the substance of the charges. Her survival is seen as evidence of her competence rather than as an indictment of the political system that failed to destroy her, alongside Ormrod's work. Further scholars, Lisa Benson, John on late medieval queenship, Gwen Seaborn on medieval women and the law, and various successors, have contributed to a broader reassessment of the place of such figures in the late medieval Anglo polity. The general effect of this work has been to move her from the category of moral warning to the category of historical study, a subject whose career illuminates, in unusual detail, the constraints and possibilities of feminine agency in late 14th century England. The trajectory of her reputation is, in itself, a case study in how historical figures are constructed and reconstructed. Walsingham's caricature persisted for centuries because it served the rhetorical purposes of successive generations of writers, and because there was no easily available body of counter-evidence that could contradict it in accessible form. When the counter-evidence became available, the caricature began to shift. What is now the scholarly picture of Alice is not necessarily the picture that will be preserved in the popular memory. The popular memory is slower to change, and moralizing stories have their own gravitational pull. But it is at least available in the works of the historians who have taken the trouble to look. She is, in the 21st century, at last visible in something closer to her actual outlines. To close the account of a life is to attempt a summing up that will not entirely succeed, because such an existence is never fully summed. There is always what the records did not preserve, what the historian's method cannot recover, what the subject herself would have said if we could ask her. The most honest closing of a biography is one that acknowledges its incompleteness. In her case, the incompleteness is unusually severe. We do not know when she was born. We do not know where she was born. We do not know who her parents were. We do not know when she first came to court, or when she first came to the king's particular notice. We do not know when she died, or where. We do not know what she thought about her own days. She left, so far as we can now see, no diary, no letters to intimate friends, no reflections. She left an estate and a set of legal actions, and the estate and the legal actions have to speak for her. They speak, when we listen carefully, of a woman of considerable practical intelligence, considerable patience, considerable resilience. They speak of someone who understood the machinery of the age she lived in with an unusual thoroughness, and who used that understanding to construct, from very unpromising raw materials, a standing of solid economic power. They speak of someone who did not, when adversity came, panic or flee, but instead applied herself methodically to the work of defense and gradual recovery. They speak of a mother who provided, in the end, for her children, and left them stations that they might otherwise never have occupied. They do not speak, in so far as we can hear them, of a wicked soul. There is no clear evidence that she took pleasure in the ruin of others. No clear evidence that she was cruel to those in her power. No clear evidence that she caused suffering beyond what was routine in the courtly and economic transactions of her era. The old charge of interference with justice is, as we have seen, difficult to substantiate in the form the chroniclers described it. The complaint of extracting fees for kingly favours is quite likely true, but it was true of many crown servants of the era, both male and female, and did not attract special moral attention when the servant in question was a man. The tale of the rings is probably legend. What she was, in the most useful summary formulation, is someone for whom the 14th century Anglo order had no ready-made category. She was not a queen. She was not a member of the nobility. She was not, in the accepted meaning of the term, a mere concubine, a temporary companion whose place depended entirely on the sovereign's whim. She was not, on the received view, a lofty heiress or a lofty widow, whose position was underwritten by inherited kin fortune. She was something the categories did not include, someone of intermediate origins who built, by her own actions, and with the essential leverage of favour at the throne, an independent economic place of major significance, and who defended it, through decades, against determined efforts to dismantle it. The order responded to the categorical failure by attempting to force her into a category. Since she did not fit the categories of legitimacy, she was placed in the category of illegitimacy. The wicked mistress, the type of the low-born concubine, the emblem of moral warning. The category did not describe her accurately, but it described her convincingly. And the description shaped how her contemporaries and posterity thought about her. Only when historians have been willing to set the category aside and look at what she actually did have they been able to see, in outline, the more complex individual that she was. There is a further point that a closing chapter should attempt, which is to ask what her career meant beyond the particulars of her own arc. It meant, for one thing, that certain things were possible for a female figure of her era that the general presumption of the moment would have denied. She could accumulate property on a major scale. She could defend that property against parliamentary attack. She could survive the loss of her chief male protector and continue to operate as an independent economic actor. These possibilities were not open equally to all. They required unusual leverage and unusual competence, but they were open. They had, in her own history, been demonstrated. Later daughters of the age and successors in later ages would not necessarily know of her example, but her precedent was, in the record, a modest but real one. Her career meant, for another thing, that the accepted structures of 14th century government could be, in certain particulars, resisted. Parliament had declared her forfeit. The parliamentary declaration had been, in large measure, frustrated. The courts had condemned her. She had worked the same courts to reverse much of the condemnation. This was not because the standard structures were weak, they were on the whole effective, but because the accepted apparatus was slow and had many moving parts. And a skilled defendant with resources could exploit the slowness and the moving parts to considerable advantage. The lesson, both in her own case and in the general history of pre-modern defence, is that the difference between having resources and not having them was, in the tribunals of the 1400s, as in the tribunals of the 21st, often the difference between survival and destruction. Her time on earth meant, most quietly, that someone of her sex could be an active participant in the making of her own biography, even when the age did not officially recognize that sex as active participants in anything. She made choices. She took decisions that shaped her future. She was not, at any point in the arc we can now reconstruct, merely acted upon. She was, in the individual paper of her actions, an agent flawed, no doubt, imperfect, no doubt, morally complicated, no doubt, but an agent nevertheless. That agency, in an order that formally denied it to those of her station, is not a modest thing to have demonstrated. To close, then, our subject was born in an England shaken by plague, into circumstances that we do not know, but that were not, evidently, promising. She came to court in the customary way of young attendants of some ability, but no distinction. She caught the attention of an aging king, and she turned that attention, across the seasons, into a standing that outran the received structures for the containment of one in her situation. She was attacked, and she defended herself. She was condemned, and she recovered much of what she was condemned to lose. She married a competent soldier who served her interests as she served his. She raised offspring whom she provided for, as well as her means allowed. She grew old on her estates, in a country that had ceased to be much interested in her. and she died in a silence that was, given the noise of her earlier prominence, in its own way peaceful. She was buried, we believe, in some quiet parish church, without monument. Her name was preserved because a hostile chronicler had made her memorable. Her actual doings were preserved insufficiently in the routine paper of the everyday administration. The final image is not of a towering monument of history, but of a private soul who did remarkable things. From the plague-thinned villages of her infancy to the manor houses of her age, she covered a distance that few of her contemporaries covered, and did so in a direction her age had not much anticipated. That she did it with the tools available to someone of her generation, that she preserved much of what she built, that she left behind offspring who lived comfortable existences on the foundations she had laid. These are, in their sum, achievements that deserve a quieter and steadier acknowledgement than the moralizing chroniclers gave her. They are, in the end, what she was. Before we close for the night, if this telling has kept you good company, please do subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so future sleep tellings find their way to you. It is a modest kindness that keeps these long, patient nights of Anglo past going. Thank you for listening and for staying with a telling that asked for patience rather than spectacle. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.